in the U.S., and I don't know here so much, but we talk a lot about integrated pest management, right? It's all about using all the different tools we have to try to control the weeds that are out there. And I like potatoes. When I talk to a group maybe about weed control, and they're not familiar with potatoes, like it's nice to actually use potatoes. Potatoes are actually a really good example of utilizing integrated pest management because we don't rely solely on herbicides. We have tillage, we have rotations, we have different varieties or different planting methodologies, you know, if you're bed planting or not. So there's a lot of different things that we do that actually disrupt that weed growth and development. And we also rely a lot on pre-emergent herbicides, whereas a lot of in the U.S., especially in the Midwest, there's a lot of GM crops and they rely heavily upon post-emergent herbicides like glyphosate, dicamba, and potatoes. We don't do that. So potatoes are actually a really good model crop for integrated pest management. So as I talked about, there's a difference, in integrated pest management, there's a handful of different things that you can talk about, right? We talked about the prevention of weeds, the culture management, utilizing physical or mechanical methods to control them. We have our chemical and biological. I'll talk about a few of these. As far as prevention and culture management, like I said, rotation's a big deal, right? We rotate our potatoes every 3 to 4 years. So what happens in the off years, right? What are we doing in those other years? Are we planting a crop that we can use different herbicides on to control weeds? Are we doing maybe more of a pasture or a cover crop type program, which provides a lot of a high density of plants, right, which might prevent weeds from growing? Those kinds of things can really disrupt that weed cycle, right? Versus if it's just the same thing over and over and over again that's being planted. So that could help a lot. And like I said, oops, wrong button there. Even your planting configuration, right? We're getting more growers that are planting in narrow rows or in beds. We just finished up, I had a grad student that just finished up a research study. We did, looked at 36, 34, 32, 30, and 28-inch row spacing. And the nice thing about the narrow row spacing, you close row a lot faster, right? Because as soon as that canopy closes, you're blocking that sunlight, and it's actually that light, that far red light that will cause those weed seeds to want to germinate. Once that goes away, they might go back into a deeper dormancy state. So it helps. So the other thing is, you know, we rent a lot of land, right? How many of you guys rent or swap land? Quite a few of you probably, right? Because of the rotation, right? And we typically don't have enough land on our farms to get all the acres of potatoes that we need to grow, right? So when we rent land, you know, we need to think of it from a weed perspective. We get as much information as we can. I mean, some people you have a long history with, right? And you have a good relationship, and you can maybe get some of these answers. Other people, if it's the first time, or it's, you know, some person that's not farmed the land for 30 years, their family, but they just rent it out, right? We need to understand what goes on, and that can help us with weed control. So understanding what has been grown there, maybe what kind of tillage, because if it's a, say if it's a no-till situation or a minimal till situation, you tend to get more of these small-seeded weeds just right on the surface, and it can change the types of weeds that you're dealing with, versus if you're plowing or using deep tillage, it can also change it. So a really important thing too, when we'll talk about later on soil carryover of herbicides, is understanding, you know, what herbicides have been used, if the mid products used that could affect your potatoes or hurt your potatoes, right? I get questions every year, this time of year, people are looking for land, right, to grow potatoes, and every year I'll get a handful of questions. People ask me, can I grow potatoes if this herbicide XYZ was used last year? And they usually already know the answer, that is probably not a good thing. Sometimes there's questions where maybe the crop rotation restriction is, say, 10 months, and you're right at 9 months or close to 10 months, right? But you know, they want to know what are the options, right? What could happen? And so, I mean, we have to go by the label. Ultimately, I can't tell them to go off label, but it usually spurs an interesting discussion because, you know, they want to put potatoes in that ground. It's a good piece. It's a good option, but they're concerned about, you know, the potential carryover herbicides in the soil. So, also understanding, you know, previous weeds and what weed problems are in that field can be important too. So, when we jump to like the mechanical and physical, this is interesting, right? Because in potatoes, we usually work the land a bit, right? It's pretty common. We're going to work the land. We often will do usually a deep chisel or ripper, often just to loosen the soil up because we have a hard pan often in our soil, so that helps the potatoes. So we're usually doing that when we go on a plant. You know, we usually our growers will usually, they'll usually run a ripper through and then field cultivate it. That's pretty common. So that's going to disrupt any weeds that might be growing early season. Then you go on and you plant and you move that soil again. And then, you know, if you go back and rehill, some of you guys may not rehill, you might just do your final hilling and planting, and that's fine. But the point is you're moving the soil again, and that's disrupting weed growth. So we're using that mechanical methodology. And then the other thing is, you know, when we harvest, right, again, we go through, we disrupt the soil. So you're disrupting the weed life cycles by doing that, even though you may not think about it, because that's just normal for potatoes, right? But that's something as potato growers you do to help control weeds. So, and then of course you can hand weed, right? That's, you know, my job when I was a young kid. So probably what's more important and what we'll talk about here is we'll get into our weed control. So historically, when you look at, this is just some data that was published in the US in this 1971, but what was interesting, they broke it into different regions in the US, and if you look here, there's primarily mechanical tillage that they use for weed control. And this was the early days before there's a lot of herbicides developed and available and registered for potatoes, right? So that's, you know, and then very few chemicals are used. And then now that's changed, right? We do a lot of our weed control through, you know, chemical control, right? Unless you're an organic grower. An organic grower might be heavily relying upon tillage. But it's been done in the past, and it's shown, you know, you can do that. But again, it's changed. Things have changed over time, right? So what do you have today? All right. I hope this list is correct. Because our list is a little bigger in the US of what products we have available. So if you break this up, you've got basically 4 different modes of action that are available for pre-emergent herbicides. Okay? Eptam is probably going to be difficult for you guys to use because you need to incorporate that immediately because it volatilizes so quickly. So most of the Eptam that's used in the US is actually used through fumigation. Either that or the other way I've seen it used is when they might be running a hiller through the ground. They might have a bar on that hiller, they're spraying it, and then they're incorporating it with the tillage or the hilling operation. But if you just spray that one, you lose it pretty quick if you don't get it incorporated. What I've learned is you guys primarily rely on Syncor, right? That's the common herbicide. And it's a very good herbicide. It has a wide range of weeds it controls. Lorox also is commonly used, right? You have Reflexis labeled. That's a little bit different one. If you ever used Syncor MZ, you know, it's got the sulfentrazone. Reflexis in the same group as sulfentrazone. So we do use that in our area a bit. And then you have your Frontier Dual, and peroxysulfone would be Zidua, depending on however it's labeled. So general rule of thumb, what I see in research and even when I see grower fields, a good general rule of thumb is one pre-emergent herbicide typically provides okay weed control, right? I mean, you're probably going to see a few escapes, but you're going to get okay. It's not going to be like that first picture I showed you where you've got this massive forest of weeds, right? 2 herbicides, if you put 2 herbicides together, and some are pre-mixed like Boundary, which has Syncor and Dual in it. I don't separate those out, and I'll tell you why in a minute, or I don't put that on there because I'm separating by groups and whatnot. But you put 2 together, you're probably going to get pretty good weed control, right? If you have 2 herbicides. And then if you put 3, if you do a 3-way combination, you're usually going to get excellent weed control. And I've seen this over and over. As a general rule of thumb, 1 is great, 2 is good, and 3 is excellent. Right? So if you put a little bit of money and a little bit of effort into your pre's, you're going to usually get much better weed control. And this is our strength, really, on potatoes for weed control. It's our pre's. We have very few options post-emergence. So if you have a weed problem or you have a challenge with weeds, you really got to rely on this. This is your toolbox, right? These are what tools you have available. So it might be, and this is a lot of our growers. A lot of our growers that I work with are using a 3-way mixture because they're trying to get multiple modes of action and multiple chemistries there to control the weed spectrum, because every herbicide has got its strengths and weaknesses. Some are better than others overall. But by mixing them together, you can really increase the amount of weed control you get. So say you have Syncor you could put Lorax with it. They're the same mode of action, but they do act differently. And then maybe you could put something like Dual, right? You can have a 3-way mixture, or you have a Syncor Reflex Dual, whatever. It doesn't really matter, but that's just a good general rule of thumb of what I see. Okay. The other good thing about that too is if you think you got maybe say you have some Syncor resistance, right? So you have some lamb's quarter that might be Syncor resistance in your field, and you're worried about that. My suggestion would be don't just pull out the Syncor because it's probably controlling a lot of other weeds at the same time. Just add to that mixture. Put another product or two in there that could help you control your lamb's quarter, and then keep your other weeds going. Because the big thing is you're probably not using Syncor every single year in that field. If you're using it every single year in the field, I would say probably pull it out because you're putting a lot of selection pressure on that weed population. But if you're growing potatoes 1 in 3 or 1 in 4 years, and the other years you're putting whatever you're putting in there, say it's a small grain or a cover crop, you're probably not putting Syncor in there, right? So that'd be the only thing. If you're doing every single year the same herbicide, yeah, I would probably pull it out just to break that cycle. But if you're not, keep it in there. Maybe you add a couple other herbicides in there, and then all of a sudden you've got a really nice package going to help control those weeds, right? You put a little bit, it's kind of an investment, right? You put a little bit more money in up front to control the weeds, and then in the back end it hopefully helps you out long term, right? And if you do a really good job with your pre-emergent program, you may not have to come back with a post-emergent herbicide, depending on, I mean, there's a lot of factors, right? You got the weather, and you got the activation and all that, but if you do a good job, sometimes you don't have to come back, and I've seen fields like that I work with growers. You get a really good upfront program. It's get that row closure to happen quickly, and then you don't have to come back with something else. So what I have over here, which is so this is water solubility. So Syncor and Frontier Max, they're very water soluble. So for a dryland grower, it's actually important to know this because if it's tending to be a dry year, right, and you don't have a lot of rain in the forecast and you're worried about activating your herbicide, Syncor and Frontier Max are going to activate much easier than these other chemistries. So it doesn't take as much water to get it solubilized and get it to be functioning right in the soil for you. Something like Zidua or even Lorax, they're much less water soluble. It takes more water to get those solubilized and get those working in the soil. So typically under irrigation situations where we can control how much water goes on, usually for Syncor or Frontier Max, we would say typically 1/3 of an inch is probably enough of water, 1/3 to 1/2 an inch. For something like Zidua or Lorax, you're probably closer to 2/3 of an inch of water you need to get it going. And we learned that the hard way when Zidua is just, I mean, it's only been registered for potatoes in our area for maybe 5 or 6 years, maybe that. But the first year we had it out on some grower fields, they only put about 1/2 inch of water on it, and it wasn't enough to activate it, so the weeds grew before we could get the herbicide activated. But what's nice also about Syncor and Frontier, if you're kind of late on your herbicide program and you need to get it activated quickly, again, it doesn't take a lot of water, they can activate it easily and quickly. So thinking about water solubility here can be important in helping you understand the program. The other thing though, with the longer, say, the more water, you also have typically a longer half-life on a lot of these products. It'll last a little bit longer. So when you're developing a herbicide program for your potatoes, you also have to think about, okay, when am I putting this herbicide on? How long is it going to be until row closure? Because most herbicides, you're probably going to get generally 3 to 5 weeks of control, generally speaking. So some products may last longer, and it also depends on the environment. Some are shorter lived. That's why there's this half-life. And this half-life varies a bit. This is just an average, kind of an average half-life. There's a lot of work that's done typically on these half-lives when the products are registered, or the soil toxicology studies act. And so it's in that general ballpark is what I'm saying. But anyways, understanding that, so when you're developing the program, okay, you might go out, you might plant, you might form your hills, you may not come back and re-hill, so you got to think about, okay, when am I going to get my herbicide on? It needs to get on before the weeds emerge, but I also need to get it on and get hopefully some rainfall, so you're going to do it before a rain event, hopefully, right? But also you got to think about, okay, I want this to last long enough, right? So you're trying to time it right, and in the real world, it doesn't always work the way you want it, right? Because stuff happens, right? So sometimes you get your herbicide on, and you don't get enough rain, right, and the weeds pop out. Or sometimes the weather's so bad you can't get a tractor out in the field after you plant, right? And then what do? You would love to get a herbicide on, but you can't get in the field. And so there are, all kinds of crazy situations that happen. But it's kind of just general principles, like what do you do, what products work, how they work. Kind of think about that. What kind of mixtures could you put together to provide good weed control? And also, like, where's the sprout? So like with Reflex, we try to put that one on. We make sure the sprout's at least 2 inches under the ground, because it can burn, it can cause some injury, especially if the plant's emerged. Dual and Frontier Max, and I'll talk about this a little later, but if you have kind of cool and wet conditions and your potatoes are starting to emerge and you've got these, we see this, I probably see this maybe 1 in every 3 years, but when you have those cool, wet conditions, the plant can't metabolize these very well, and then you do get some injury from them. But every compound, you gotta remember, every herbicide that's used, the plant has to somehow deal with it, right? It's not just like magically it just rolls off the leaves and it doesn't affect it, right? It gets into the plant has to deal with it. It's either going to metabolize it, sequester it, do something with it. It takes energy for the plant to deal with the herbicide. And yeah, you might lose, say you might lose 0.5% or 1/4% of yield from a herbicide, right? But it's better than losing 20 or 30% yield, right? So farming is risk management decisions. That's the way I look at it. You're going to do something to manage your risk, but what's the negative consequence of that, right? Does it outweigh the benefit? And that's what you're always having to decide, I think, as growers. So.
And that was on the Reflex only, or?
On Reflex for 2 inch?
Yes.
It's a good general principle, 2 inches under, because every potato plant isn't going to be the same place, right? And that's the other thing, if you're going out and scouting the field, don't just look up 2 hills, do 20 feet a row or something. Look at, 10 or 20 plants to get an average, height, right, where you're at. It's kind of a good principle just for safety speaking, because the thing is, if that sprout's just right under the soil and you spray your herbicide and then you get a big rain and it pushes it down right on that sprout, at a pretty high concentration, it could affect it, right? Reflex isn't, we have other herbicides that we use that are have much higher potential of damage. That's what I would say. Reflex isn't a bad one, in my opinion, but you just got to be careful, I guess, is what I'm saying, and be aware. So.
And then based on the experience that the growers, or majority of the growers in the Red River Valley, that probably have similar situation with irrigated crops, what is the most common chemical treatment that you have seen there that they are using most successfully there?
Yeah, no, it's a good question. So I see Syncor Dual and also the Frontier Max are probably the most common ones. That
all blended pre-emergence?
Usually 2, maybe, yeah, they wouldn't put Frontier and Dual together as one or the other.
Okay.
So, because they're very similar. They're very similar in their weed spectrum. They're very similar in how they act. So you're only going to put either one or the other. So I did a survey a number of years ago, and yeah, Syncor and Dual were at the top of the list of what were being used. They use some of these other ones. In dry land, again, the deciduous is going to be a little bit harder in dry land because you need more water to activate it. So you have to check the MRLs on that one, because I don't think all the MRLs are established still for that one. Still a fairly new product, and most new products, they take a while to get those MRLs established. Lorox, the one thing about that, we don't use that in our dry land because our organic matter is about 5%, and it ties up really rapidly to organic matter. So that's the one thing on Lorox is lower organic matter is good. High organic matter ties it all up and it doesn't become effective.
Okay.
So we don't use F10 because again the incorporation is a challenge. But from this list, though, yeah, it'd be Syncor, Dual, Frontier Max. Probably not as much Reflex. I don't see that as much. I see it more in the irrigated acres, especially when weeds tend to be a little bit more problematic.
We have a product here, versus with the blend of that, right? It's Boundary?
Boundary has,
Boundary, right?
Boundary would be
Metribuzin with methylchlor, right?
Yeah, exactly, metribuzin plus
So
methylchlor. We have the same thing too.
Is the same?
Yeah, but I didn't put it together on this list because then this gets messy over here.
Yep,
So
that makes sense.
you know, but no, it's a good combination. I would say Dual and Syncor, they play really well together, as well as Lorox and Dual, they play really well together.
Okay.
They're good partners. Even our label on Lorox does talk about the two together, Dual and Lorox, using those together.
Okay.
And then I'll show some data too on Syncor and Lorox together. We like those together too. They make nice partners. The only thing is you're really only in one mode of action doing that. So especially if we've got resistance issues, it's nice to, you want to think about maybe popping something else in that tank. You know, just because you don't want to continue that problem, right?
Sure. No,
That makes sense.
Thanks, Andy.
Yeah, no problem. Any other questions? Yes.
How critical is the timing? You talk, we're dryland growers, so
Yep.
we spray and we don't get rain for a week
Yep.
or 10 days.
Yep.
When the product is activated, does that increase your half-life time, or does it sort of, or does that change it, or is your product,
And most of
sitting
these
there
products are
idle?
quite stable.
okay?
The big one would be Eptam. If you had that, you'd lose that one if it wasn't activated, and you would lose it rapidly, like in hours.
Yes.
Minutes to hours. I mean,
Yeah.
it's
Yeah.
very rapid.
Yeah.
But yeah, my understanding, most of these products are quite stable.
Okay.
You're not going to just lose them. The biggest concern I have, well, the two big concerns I have, if you spray it and it just stays dry for a week or 10 days, is if you have a big windstorm come up,
Yep.
can it pick up and blow away and go somewhere where it shouldn't?
Right.
And the other thing is, are those weeds going to emerge before it becomes activated, and then you lose that? But in dryland farming, you can't really control the weather,
No.
and so you do the best you can, right? And
Sure.
you do the best you can and hope for the best, right?
Yep.
And
Okay.
there are, I mean, I've seen in our area too, where we applied a lot of pre's and we don't get the moisture in time, that we start pop. There's still soil moisture, subsoil moisture, and
Yep.
enough for the weeds to pop out. And then you got a battle on your hands, right? Because then
Right.
you're trying to control them post-emergence with very limited options,
Okay.
and right,
Right.
it becomes a challenge, right? So, yeah, it's hard. I think dryland farming potatoes has got to be some of the most difficult farming there is to do. No, seriously, because there's so much risk in potato production, and that water is the most limiting factor, right? We joke around in the Red River Valley that we can get a crop insurance claim both for a flood and a drought in the same year. Because we might have a super wet spring, but then an insanely dry fall, and I mean, you guys know how it is. So,
Okay.
I mean, it's just a reality of farming in a dryland situation, right? When you don't have irrigation, and so yeah, again, you make the best decisions you can based on what you have, and then you have to react, right? So, yeah. So I mean, yeah, and then again, of course, it's hard. Do I put a lot of money into my pre-emergent program if I'm not sure if it's going to actually work, right? So that's another decision you have to make, right, as a grower. And, I can't tell you what to do, but I can give you thoughts and ideas and share data and information. That's what I try to do with our growers. I try to share with them as much information as I can, just to help them make their decisions, right? So,
Thank you.
does that help?
Yes, no, absolutely.
Okay. Any other thoughts, questions? Everyone's having a good time, I guess. All right, so post-emergence options. So you've got your grass herbicides, right? So if you've got grasses, you've got group 1s. Make sure you check your label. Typically the amount of product varies by the weed height. At least for us it does. They actually recommend higher rates the taller the grass is. The other really important thing is to make sure you include an adjuvant. An adjuvant is going to be extremely important because every leaf surface has this cuticle, this waxy layer on it, is to help protect it, right? And you want to get through that waxy layer to get the herbicide in the plant to kill the weed. So we typically will use some kind of non-ionic surfactant because it's less damaging to the potatoes. If you use some kind of oil surfactant, typically we see more burn in the potatoes, so we try to stay away from those on post-emergence. So NIS is good. You have a few options, it looks like. And these herbicides are great because it's all based upon the cellular structure in the plants. They don't affect broadleaves, they don't affect grasses. So those are your grass options. This is your, I mean, and then you get into your Prism and your Syncor, and those are your workhorses, right? And I say, really the big one for us is Prism, right? Because if you're growing any kind of smooth skin potato, a red, a yellow, a white, you're probably not going to be putting Syncor on that, because typically or generally Syncor is going to hurt the leaves of most smooth skin potatoes. And even some russets are sensitive, have susceptibility to Syncor. So you got to be careful with that one post-emergence. And so what are you left with then? You're left with Prism. I mean, that's pretty much all you got, right? If you're growing a fresh table crop, or like a Shepherdie, or trying any other russets that might be sensitive to metric views. And I think ivory russets a bit. But anyways, but yeah, so what do you have left? I mean, that's your workhorse. And it's interesting for us in the US, the Prism is labeled as a pre or a post. And most growers still use it post because it's really your one big option. But I really encourage them not to use it pre, because I don't like to see them use two treatments of the same compound, because again, that's increasing your selection pressure for herbicide resistance. So, but that's the nice thing about it. If you do put Prism on for post-emergence weeds, it'll also help prevent weeds from it'll also act as a pre-emergent too for any other weeds that are in the soil. So you kind of get a double effect off of Prism, which is nice. So, the same with Syncor. It'll affect weeds that have emerged, but it also works as a pre-emergent too. So, but really for both of them, you want to be spraying small weeds that are 1 to 2 inches, 2 to 5 centimeters. That's about all. That's really the target. Yes, you can knock down weeds that are bigger, but again, you might be increasing that selection pressure for resistance if you're trying to spray weeds that are 8 or 10 inches tall. Or that would be what? 20 centimeters, right? We want to talk in metric. So I go back and forth all the time. It's funny because in the US, everything is imperial, but in science, everything is metric. And then if I go to other countries, it's usually metric. And then I go to Canada, and it's metrics and imperial, right?
Yeah.
Liters per acre. I can't translate those on the fly, but I can usually do like liters per hectare, or kgs per hectare, or pounds per acre. So I can give it to you one way or the other, probably. So anyway, so here's your options, and then you do have Ignite that's labeled prior to ground crack, right? So I know a lot of growers like to use glyphosate. We can talk about that too. Glyphosate is an excellent herbicide. It's a once-in-a-lifetime herbicide. It controls most weeds, right? It's very inexpensive. It's actually a better grass herbicide than it is a broadleaf herbicide. And you have to be careful with glyphosate, is what I would say. I mean, I have growers that I work with. I know they use it, right? A lot of our growers will use a winter rye crop, for a cover crop. And even with the tillage in the spring and the planting, you still don't eliminate all of it, and you still have to terminate some of those plants. And so, what I see commonly in our area is they'll put together a program with, maybe 2 or 3 pre's, and then they might add a glyphosate or an Ignite in the tank to clean up any kind of cover crops, that are still left, or maybe there might be a few weeds that have emerged. But either way, if you're using an Ignite or a glyphosate or something like that, it's actually really important that your potatoes have not come out of the ground. More so for glyphosate, because glyphosate actually moves in the plant as a translocating herbicide. It's going to move to the growing points of the plant, usually the newest leaves and the roots and or tubers if there's tubers on it. Ignite is a contact herbicide. It's not really going to move much. It's going to kind of hit what it touches, so it's a little safer. As far as, if there might be 1 or 2 little plants popping out of the ground, you'll just burn them. Back in the days, you guys used to have the Gramoxone, Canada used to have it. I knew growers in Alberta, they'd wait till their plants were up 6 inches and they spray with Gramoxone and burn the plants and, get the weeds knocked back, right? And then, of course, PMRA took that away from you guys. And, they were trying to control the weeds that had emerged, right, doing that. But you also do hurt the potato plant quite a bit doing that as well. But the point is, you really don't want to, when that plant's young and it's growing, you really don't want to set it back and burn it. Because when you burn the leaves like that, if you actually looked at the roots would be brown and they'd be burnt too, and you probably were setting that plant back 10 to 14 days would be my guess. And when you think about that, if you burn your plants early in the season, you set them back. See, do you guys ever have frost in the spring on your potatoes? Do you ever burn? It's kind of like the same idea, right? You burn that plant from frost and then it has to regrow and it might take, a week or two. And you think about it, if you just lost, say you just lost 10 days of growth, when you're bulking at the end of the season, say you're bulking 5 to 7 sacks a day per acre, right? Multiplied by 10, you just lost 50 to 75 hundredweight, right? By beating that plant up at the early part of the year, right? So you just cost yourself probably your profit. So that's why you got to be careful if you're using some kind of herbicide to burn the weeds or the cover crop or whatever. You got to be careful on that and make sure you get that on in time so you're not affecting your potato plant, so that makes sense. So that's how I think about it. I think about, okay, if you're setting your plant back, then what's it going to do on your yield? So, any questions on post-emergence herbicides for weed control?
Andy,
yes.
It's a common practice for some of us here to use reduced rates of Sencor mixed with Prism and post-emergence.
Yep.
Yes.
Yep.
Is that we reduce the rates of Sencor to avoid the
carryover?
Yeah.
Yep.
Is that something that you have seen?
We do that a lot too.
Okay.
Because we grow a lot of small grains.
Okay.
Yeah, so commonly used in our area too. I see it on the dry land. I see them sometimes even use reduced rates. So I see the reduced rates used. Only caution on reduced rates if we've got a herbicide resistance issue in the field. We need to be careful with that. So if you're going to reduce your Syncor or Metribuzin, make sure you're using the full rate of Prism.
Yes, we do.
Yeah,
we do. Yeah.
So that's what I would say. Really keep that full rate of Prism on, because you need to have something to give it a good punch, right? You can't just give it a half punch and hope it kills the weed, right? But yeah, generally speaking, when we talk about, and I'll talk about this later, but when we talk about resistance management, you always want to use full entire rates of products. But in this situation, when you've got a carryover concern, yeah, you have to address that, right? So
yeah.
You got to be able to plant you following small grain crop or whatever it is that could be affected, right? So.
But with this practice, have you seen an increase in resistance level of the weeds to Metribuzin because we are using those low rates?
I haven't seen it.
Okay.
But what I would say, at least in our area, we're typically on about we try to be on a 4-year rotation, and our in-between years is pretty common to have crops like sugar beets or soybeans or dry beans or corn, and so they're usually putting on different herbicide modes of action to clean up the weeds. And the other thing is we have a lot more chemistries. We have about 15 total herbicides that we have labeled in potatoes in the U.S. And so there's a little bit more diversity of also what we can apply. So that helps as well, I would say. But yeah, when you drive around, you're going to see fields of lamb quarters. And lamb's quarters, nightshade, and pigweeds are our big 3 species that we deal with, right? It's weeds. So we've never really documented resistance to Syncor or Metribuzin on lamb's quarters. It's possible it's there, but yeah, but we do, I know our dryland growers, but they do use reduced rates of Syncor because they like to follow with wheat or barley. And we also were very careful with Prism too, because that causes problems with rotation of sugar beets. So we have to deal with that as well. So yeah, herbicide is not like you can just write a plan up and do it on every field, right? It's very complicated. If you want to do a good job, right? It's a complicated endeavor. You have to do and think about. You got to think about your weed species. You got to think about your crop. You got to think about your soil type, what's going to be grown next year, right? And all these things, right? So it's, I hope that I've given you guys ideas and things to think about and ways that maybe you think about you can improve your practices, right, and what you're doing. So, So yeah, any other questions here? Got a quieter group here, Ryan, because I know you're recording it. Okay. So yeah, like I was just talking about too, sometimes you got to think about what you're applying, you know, because you can get variety susceptibility. So this is metribuzin or Syncor injury. You see venochlorosis, that's very common. And this is actually where we charge the boom at, in front of a plot, but the same thing could happen in the field, right? If you're charging your boom, and it might be in the field, maybe not on the edge, right? You can see this, or sensitive variety, you might see this on. So metribuzin, when you're applying it post-emergence too, the label says something to the effect of having like sunny, warm weather for 3 days before, 3 days after, because again, the plant has to metabolize, it has to deal with it. So by the plant being healthy and vigorously growing, it's going to be able to overcome it. And the other reason you might use reduced rates of Syncor is if the variety is sensitive. Yeah, that's the other reason you might be doing that. So, but it's what tools you have in the toolbox, and you're trying to figure out the best ways to use them. Many tubers can be also, you have to be careful with herbicides on many tubers. Most of our growers bring seed tend to use reduced rates intentionally because they don't want to hurt the seed. For us, Prism is not labeled for many tubers. First year, I've seen injury from it. It's pretty ugly. So we stay away from Prism on that. Once you get your second generation in the field or third generation, it's fine. Again, we talked about weed spectrum, we talked about timing. So there's all these things you have to think about, like we talked about. So how can you maximize the efficacy of your herbicides? So just some things to think about. Like we talked about tillage of water. If you're growing dry land and if you have the ability and you can see the forecast, right? It'd be nice if you could just apply it a day or two before it rains, right? If that's possible. Not always possible, right? Depending on your farm size and how busy you are. But that can help. And like I said too, freeze, like we try to get them on at least when the sprouts at least 2 inches under the soil surface. That's the best you can do usually. Sometimes there are situations where, right, they pop out of the ground or they're just barely starting to pop and you already have your herbicide plant and you want to use it. I've known growers to go out and re-hill their potatoes just to bury them so they can put their products on. So that's been done. Again, post, try to keep with small weeds, 1 to 2 inches. I say 1 here, but that 1 inch usually varies, as you're looking in the field, right? So. But again, you're going to get much better control off of a post plant if the weeds are small. And you're going to put less selection pressure on it. Use adjuvants. Anytime you're using a post herbicide, make sure you use an adjuvant. And then tank mixtures are really important, I think. They can help you a lot. Like I said, if you got resistance, put other products in the tank. That's going to help you out. So other things to consider when you're doing pre's. pH is important. Organic matter, like I said, lower oxygen, a lot of organic matter. It's going to get tied up in the organic matter and not work. That's important. Understanding your texture. A lot of labels, when you look at them, they're going to vary on the rates you can use. If it's a fine soil, a clay soil versus a sandy soil, right? Your rates will vary because, again, that label's trying to say, okay, well, if you've got a soil with organic matter that's really fine, it's got high CEC, it's probably going to bind up more of that herbicide, so you're going to need a little bit more, right, to get the weed control. So make sure you read your labels and understand what they say. Soil moisture is important too, because again, having good moisture in the soil is going to help activate it. It's not going to activate it alone, but if your soil is already moist, you put your herbicide on as a pre, and then it rains, it's going to help get that activated. And most of those pre-emergent herbicides, they're going to stay in that top 1 to 2 inches of the soil, and that's where your weed seeds are at anyways. Most of your weed seeds that are going to germinate, they're just right on top. And that's what you want. You want to just get a nice blanket right over that field to keep those weeds from growing.
Any question about the water?
Yep.
For Lorox and Syncor, if you have excessive, so lack of water doesn't activate properly.
Right.
If we have and we have had a situation like that, excessive water, let's say 3 inches of water in 1 day, that's another explanation for the herbicide not being effective. So it goes down. You can get if you get a really lot of water, right, it could potentially wash the herbicide off the hill. It could potentially leach it more, especially the more water soluble compounds like Syncor. Definitely, yeah. I mean, we had a lot of rain last year.
I don't remember, I mean, we didn't even turn our, I mean, we plant in like first part of May, we didn't even turn our pivots on until like late June, maybe we had 15 inches of rain in 2 months. You know, I was actually surprised how well the herbicides did for as much rain as we got. But yeah, we did have probably more weed escapes than normal. So yeah, but yeah, Metribuzin or Frontier Max, they're going to, since they're so water soluble, they're going to tend to probably move more and get activated quicker. But something like Lorox, I think it's 1/12 less soluble than Metribuzin. It's going to stick around a little bit longer.
So it should actually.
It should,
work,
yeah,
right?
it should help it, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, those higher water events will probably help it stick around a little. I mean, it probably stick around a little bit more would be my thought. But yeah, I mean, yeah, a lot of water usually isn't good. You know, you want that nice, gentle rainfall, right? I mean, that's what we all want as potato growers in the spring and in the fall, that nice, gentle rainfall. But it doesn't usually happen the way we want it to, right? So, but yeah, I mean, yeah, you have to consider that too, right? And so, I mean, that could be a management decision. If it looks like you got a big rainstorm coming, do you put your pre on then, or do you put it on right after, or you know, how do you manage that, or do you change your product? You know, change to maybe different products that are less water soluble. Or, I mean, it's hard to know, right, what the best decision is because you often are making that on the fly, right? So that's just agriculture and that's farming. And like I said, if farming was easy, everybody would do it. So it's only left for the best to do. So like I said with pre's, typically, again, general rule of thumb, you're probably going to get a 3 to 5 week window of weed control, right? That's typically what they're going to last. Depending on, again, the products used, the environment. So, like I said, potatoes, we're going to use tillage, we're going to plant. We often come back and we often plant and we'll come back and rehill about 7 to 10 days later. So our typical program is spread some fertilizer, till it, then come back and plant, and then we'll put a lot of we actually do a lot of fertilization for nitrogen on right prior to hilling. Usually we're using ESN or urea, maybe some AMS if we need some sulfur, or some MAP or DAP if we need a little phosphorus. That's pretty common, and so we put that right on before the hilling, then we re-hill it and mix that into the hill. So since we have GPS now, everything's done blind hilling, right? And then after that, we'll put our herbicide on. That's a typical program that most of our growers do. That would be probably, I guess, more irrigated on our dry land. I'd say most of our fertilizers on pre-plant, we plant, and then they usually do come in and re-hill. And we do have, I see in the dry land more of the power hillers nowadays. So they like to really, and I think one of the reasons they run the power hillers too is to break up the clods. We got a lot of clods. Our soil's in our dry land area, there's a lot of clay content. And so they're trying to keep the number of clods down. So when you come to harvest, you're not bruising potatoes so much. But they'll run the power hiller through there and then they'll put their herbicide on. So yeah, so dry land is pretty much all the fertilizers pre-plant incorporated, then we plant, and then we come back and re-hill and put our herbicide on. So, and then we follow it up with a post-emergence if needed. These are things we talked about, kind of how we can optimize the weed control, mainly trying to use an integrated pest management like we talked about is important. Yeah, I mean, we talked about all this stuff, so I'm not going to go into it more. So, talking about herbicide resistance then, is there any, I guess before we get into this, any more questions on herbicides and herbicide use for weed control? And kind of just generally covering a lot of things, yeah.
I do have one question. Last year we had a really dry spring, and I saw a pattern across the province of, like, we would normally plant headlands and then plant the field along direction, so we had short rows of the first field. So the farmer would spray it along the field and then spray the headland, and sometimes have an overlap.
Overlap, yeah.
On the main part of the field. Would a double rate of a herbicide as opposed to a pre-herbicide there increase or decrease the water solubility enough to have a weed escape there?
That's a good question. If a double herbicide application would decrease or increase the solubility.
Like you'd need double the amount of water to fully activate that double rate of herbicide, or am I thinking wrong?
I don't know. I'm trying to think about it too. Like, it's still gonna. I mean, it's still gonna be activated. I think.
Yeah.
So I think it would still get activated because it's still a fair bit of water.
Yeah.
But I mean, I can see it could maybe take slightly more I mean, and usually what we say is that water activation, we're trying to get full herbicide activation, right? You can get part of it activated at a lower rate, right?
Yeah.
But,
It
yeah,
just
it-
seemed that there was a pattern in the first part of the field that, employed control and then the rest
Yeah.
of the field seemed to look at
Yeah, I don't know, that's an interesting, I've never had that question, so. Usually when you get a double application, you actually see
Yeah.
better weed control
Well,
and you see
usually more is better, yeah.
and more injury in the potato crop,
It's
so,
not-
you know. But yeah, no, I don't know, yeah, that's a good question, so, I don't know.
Yeah.
Any other questions?
What is your typical rate when you're applying Sencor for gallons per acre? What is your water?
How much water?
How much
As
water?
a pre or a post?
On a pre.
Oh, good. We had this question yesterday, so. I would say a lot of our growers are probably at probably around 7 to 10 gallons an acre because they're trying to cover as many acres as they can.
Okay. That's very light for us.
That's what we talked about yesterday.
Very light.
And maybe it's not a good thing. Maybe we need more water.
Yeah, no, I just.
And like I said, I don't know. It's something, I'm gonna look into that actually, because we had a good discussion on that yesterday about actually increasing the water volume, so you get maybe more coverage, better coverage for the soil. But that's usually, it comes down to us. Most of our farms, I mean, they're gonna be, our small ones are gonna be 500 to 1,000 acres of potatoes, so they're trying to cover a lot of ground really fast, and they don't want to stop for water, right? We do get some applied by air on years where it's really wet and you can't get a tractor in the field, or, you know, last year was so wet. I remember one farmer, we had research trials on their farm. We ended up getting, they sprayed the whole field with drones because they had drones out, helicopters, planes, and ground rigs, because our window was like this tight with all the rain we had. It was just like, we had like this little, we had these little windows, you just try to get herbicide on everything as quick as you can and do everything you possibly could, right? So. Yeah, it's sometimes, yeah, you're going, again, you're trying to do the best you can, but yeah, if you're going by air, you're gonna have much less water, right? But if you're going by ground, you can definitely put more water in the tank. That's easy to do. And if you feel like more water is helping you out,
That's just it's just sort of what we've grown up with, I guess.
Yeah.
We would use 25 gallons of water.
yep. Well, what I would say
When we
over
were applying
time,
Sencor.
yeah, what I would say over time, in general, what I've seen with herbicide applications, they just keep reducing the amount of water in our area, because again, they're trying to be more efficient
Yeah.
and get more acres covered. And there's a lot of custom applicators too. They don't, you know, they gotta haul all that water to the field and all this and that, right? So it's an efficiency thing, right? And even, yeah, I'd have to check on the pre's of where they're at, but I know post for sure they're at 7 to 10 gallons.
I wouldn't even apply Roundup that light.
Yeah. Yeah, no, it happens in our area, and they're also probably driving 50 miles an hour too, and they're just zipping through fields, so, you know, I mean, it's crazy.
No, it's what you're doing. I just was
Yeah.
wondering what you do in your area.
Yeah, that's common, yeah. When I'm doing research, we're at 15 gallons an acre on our research. When we do everything with our, either we have a hand boom or four-wheeler, we stick at 15. Yeah, I mean, when we do desiccants, right, like Rayground, we
Yep.
try to be 20. 20 is probably common, 20, 25 is common for our desiccants
Okay, yeah.
right now. Because that's all about coverage
Yes,
there. You know,
yes.
you're using a contact herbicide, you want as much coverage as you possibly can
Yes,
get.
yeah.
If it's a systemic herbicide, you tend to use lower rates because, you know, a few big droplets on a leaf is all you need. You don't need to cover the whole leaf.
What about prism and post emerge?
It's, like I said, it's
Still
like a
that
7
low?
to 10. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah,
Yep.
so I would use 20.
Yeah, you're probably gonna get better coverage, and you're probably gonna be able to get probably a few more of those weeds, I would think, they're sitting under a leaf, right? You just need to get a few drops on it, you don't need a bunch,
But
but
then we need more sticker because we're using more water, so then you.
it increases that, right? Right,
So,
yeah.
yeah, so it's,
Yeah, 'cause yeah, I mean, when, yeah, those stickers or adjuvants, they're on a volume basis, right?
yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yep.
Water volume doesn't have an impact on the efficacy of the product. If you want to use 25 gallons versus.
It's all about coverage.
Yeah.
Yeah, because, you know, it's just a concentration, right?
Yeah.
So, if you're spraying at 100 gallons or 10 gallons, if you're spraying at 100 gallons an acre, you're going to put a tenth of the product that you put if you're doing a 10 gallons an acre, right? So, you got the same concentration in the water, right? So, it shouldn't matter. Okay. All right, so herbicide resistance. So there's kind of two thoughts of why we have herbicide resistance, right? One is the continual use of the same mode of action. It puts so much selection pressure, right, that you eventually get weeds that aren't killed by that herbicide mode of action, and they survive and they reproduce, right? So that's probably the most common thought one. The other thought is using reduced rates, right? Using reduced rates may cause herbicide resistance. So, anyways, again, like I said, how do you prevent it? You're gonna want, like our biggest thing in the U.S. is talking about using multiple modes of action, right? There's been a big push for like our soybean and corn acres because they'll plant it, they'll just spray with glyphosate twice, right? And they'll plant corn and then spray with glyphosate, then plant soybeans and spray with glyphosate, and back and forth. I mean, well, what do you think's going to happen when you do that, right? I mean, you're going to get resistance, right? So their big push has been they're actually starting to encourage a lot of pre's now, and even Syncor, which puts a little bit more pressure on me because I'm like, hey, that's kind of like our little baby for potatoes, right? Syncor, and now you guys are using it in your soybeans, and it's going to actually increase selection pressure on our weeds. But anyways, that's what a lot of our row crop growers are starting to do, really trying to increase the modes of action they're using, really trying to increase the pre's that are being used. And then, like I said, when you're dealing with resistant weeds, you really want to use the full label, right? You don't want to cut it back. You know, do everything you can to control those weeds. Like we talked about earlier, rotation can be really important. Using tillage can be really important, and making sure you spray small weeds, right? Don't try to kill big weeds with your Prism or your Syncor, because that's not a good thing. All right, so basically, herbicide resistance is when a plant survives a normal herbicide application, right? So when we actually test for resistance, when scientists test for resistance, the typical pattern is you put a 1x, you typically grow them in a greenhouse, you put a 1x rate of the product over it, and then you put a 3x rate of the product over it. And typically if the 3x rate doesn't kill it, then you consider it's resistant. And you can go higher rates and whatnot, build a dose response curve and all this and that jazz. But basically, if a 3x rate doesn't kill it, we're going to say it's probably resistant. So anyways, what happens, like I said, you get selection pressure, maybe you get two weeds that are resistant to a herbicide, they reproduce, and that just continues on, right? So, not good. So, like I said, frequent use of a similar mode of action, low herbicide rates are typically causes for it, and then also using the same rotation, the same mode of action and rotation, right? So, that probably is going to enhance it. So how do you manage this? So you really want to get rid of those weeds. When you think about it, and when you look at a lot of these weeds, it's not uncommon for these weeds, when they reproduce, it's not uncommon for them to produce thousands of seeds, if not tens of thousands of seeds when they reproduce, right? So those seed heads, they don't look big, but most of those seeds are extremely small, especially like pigweeds, lamb's quarters. They're just these little black, tiny little seeds, right? And so if you have just one weed in a field that's resistant and it reproduces, all of a sudden you've got thousands of potential resistant weeds. Probably not all of them are, but a lot of them will be. And they won't all just emerge next year. They might emerge over the next 2 or 3 years, right? So if you can at least eradicate, let's say if you've got a field, you've got known resistance, and you have a few escapes in there, it's going to pay dividends just to go out and remove those few plants before they actually produce seeds, because you're just increasing that problem by letting them reproduce and drop seeds all over the field. So it does pay. You got to think about, I mean, we're really good as humans about just thinking about the current year, or the current situation, right? But if we want to maybe expand that vision a little bit, think about the next 5 to 10 years, right? How do you want that farm to be, those fields? What's, long-term sustainability is, get rid of those weeds if you can, even if it means just going out there with a shovel or a hoe and knocking them out. If they start to have seeds on them, take a garbage bag with you and put them in a garbage bag and take them out of the field, right? Don't let those weeds continue to repopulate, because we know there's resistance, and we know it's just going to continue to cause problems. And the reality is, we don't have like a bunch of new herbicides coming in potatoes. Companies don't develop herbicides for potatoes. They develop them for corn, for soybeans, for wheat, for the large acre crops where they can get the most return on their investment. It costs them over $300 million just to develop a new compound. So to think that they're going to build a herbicide for potatoes, they're not. Potatoes usually get a herbicide if something's been developed for another crop and it looks like it might work in potatoes, and then all of a sudden we get lucky and we get one, right? But there's a lot of risk involved too, because potatoes are so expensive to produce. The company doesn't want to have that risk of it hurting, so they're very cautious to bring us new herbicides. So point is, don't think there's going to be a new herbicide, because who knows if there will be or won't be. It's better to go out and eliminate it, okay? If you have a known field to have resistance, just like if you had a soil-borne issue, say mop top, powdery scab, warts, anything, right? Try to limit, try to knock the dirt off the tires and off the equipment before you leave the field, right? If you know you've got a, same with a weed, if you've got a herbicide-resistant weed in this field and then one next one you go into doesn't, clean your equipment beforehand. Leave those weeds, seeds in that field so you don't spread your problem to another field, right? Same idea as soil-borne diseases, right? Like I said, you can try to avoid the herbicide, but if you don't have many options, put other herbicides in the tank. Because like I said, if you've got Syncor-resistant lamb's quarter, but say you also got 3 or 4 other weed species in there you feel like the Syncor's taken care of, you can leave the Syncor in there to take care of those, but then you just want to make sure you add something good to try to control that lamb's quarter, right? Rotation's good, like we talked about, potatoes. Sometimes it might even be, if you're growing a cover crop, you might even just go out and just mow the weeds down or do something so they don't reproduce again. You can, like I say, fallow, that's another option, but you probably, here's probably not a good place to fallow because of all the natural rain. You're just going to grow weeds anyways, so you're probably better off just planting a cover crop in there and then making sure the weeds don't go to seed. And then, yeah, you can always seek advice from others, right? So just some ideas and thoughts there on managing herbicide-resistant weeds. Like I said, for lamb's quarters, I know that's an issue here. Pre-emergent herbicides are your best friend for lamb's quarter, right? Lamb's quarter, you know how it has that mealy white texture on the leaf surface? That makes it very difficult actually for post-emergent herbicide to get into the leaves of that plant. It's really good at resisting. I mean, if you drop some water on like a lamb's quarter leaf, you'll just see that water just kind of roll off. I mean, it's like built to resist spraying, I feel like, right? I don't know, it's crazy, right? So, and we see, like I see lamb's quarter every year. Lamb's quarter is a weed I see everywhere in the world. There's a lot of places, and I've seen a lot of potatoes, and lamb's quarters everywhere. The best way to really control it is with your pre-emergent program. It's fairly easy to control with a good pre-emergent program. Like I said, you may not, dryland, you have challenges, right? Getting your pre on and getting it activated and all that, right? You're gonna have challenges there, but if you can control your lamb's quarter on your pre-emergent program, that is your best option. That is your best bet. Trying to control post-emergence is always a challenge. So use your herbicides, use your tools, and see if you can't get it better. Pre-package on there to control it. Like I said, tillage we use. Make sure we spray small weeds again. And then, like, this is a big one here too. If you know you've got a problem with resistant lamb's quarter, use your rotations to try to focus on eliminating it. So you could plant a different crop there that might allow a different herbicide that you could use to help control it, right? Even if you're, say you're on a 4-year rotation on your potatoes, maybe there's a chemistry you can use that it might have a longer residual, maybe it has a 2-year residual before you can plant potatoes, but you can do that, say, the year after potatoes and try to get some control options done on your lamb's quarter. So you can use these other cropping systems, like I said, to control the lamb's quarter, either through herbicides or through mowing or through tillage or whatever it is. Just think about ways to get creative, on ways that you might be able to put some pressure on the lamb's quarter. And then, like I said before, make sure you eliminate these weeds before they develop seeds. So, like I said, it's either getting some iron. Iron, there's no resistance to iron. Iron always works if you know how to properly wield it. Okay. I'm going to kind of hop through. This is just kind of how some herbicides work. We'll just hop through those quick. So like I said, this is with the like the Dual and the Frontier Max. Like I said, I see this a fair bit. You get a cool wet spring. Sometimes that sprout comes up. It hits that layer of where the where the herbicide's at, and it might kill that sprout, so then it regrows out the axillary stems, and it can slow the growth down, and you'll see this right here sometimes, just a little bit of crinkling on the leaves. That's again from the plant not metabolizing the herbicide. And so there always is this caution with Frontier Max and Dual that they can do this, and it will set the plants back maybe a week or two. So again, that could affect your yield at the end of the year. So, okay, so that's that. This is actually what happens with reflex when you plant. We did, because in research we always push the limits on things. We're always trying to figure out what happens if you don't do it the right way. This is reflex actually put on post-emergence when they were just a rosette, but it's not great. So I often get this question too. So what do you do when you miss your window for putting your pre's on? Right? What do you do when you're too late? You got your potatoes planted, the weather was just not favorable to get out and spray it, and now all of a sudden your potatoes are coming out of the ground. Right? Real world situation, right? So, options, yeah, what to do here, right? So, trying to get my lid on here. So, do you continue with your original program? Do you switch to a plan B? Which might include a lot of different things. I think it really depends upon what is your original program, right? What products are in that original program? Are they potentially going to cause injury to the potatoes if they're just emerging, right? So some compound like reflex, I wouldn't put reflex on if they're popping out of the ground, but something like a Syncor, you're going to be fine with that because it's already labeled post anyways. So Dual could cause some injury. Outlook could potentially cause some injury, but you just got to think about what to do. Do you go back and reform the hills to cover them up? Do you, do you do something else, right? So, or do you just rely on your post-emergence program, right? So that's what you have to think about. What do you do in those situations? What's going to work? What's not going to work? What's the risk management here for your decisions? So, so like I said, understanding your chemistry, knowing what they do, what's safe, what's not safe, what's the potential injury? Could they, are you willing to deal with a little bit more injury? Is that okay? What's your weed pressure in that field? If you know it's a light weed pressure, maybe you could rely more on a post-emergence program than a pre. Or do you start your post-emergence program earlier? Timing. So, anyways, those are things you have to decide. So, there's a company that sells Lorax in the U.S. and they were trying to figure this out too because I was getting asked this question and they were getting asked this question. And so we did a study on Linuron and metribuzin, the combination of the two. What happens when you put it on at different timings, say if it was late. So it's not labeled for a post-emergence. Lorax is not, but we were just trying to understand what would happen. So just keep that in mind. This is not, for us, it's not labeled. So we applied it pre-emergent, that your normal pre-emergent timing. We applied it when you had about 50–60% emergence. They're just starting to pop out of the ground. And then we did it 4-inch tall plants and about 8-inch tall plants, 8 or 10-inch tall plants. And what was interesting, this is the emergence, like right when they're emerging. I was out in the field 4 days after we sprayed it, and they were just had this. You can't maybe see it so well, but they just kind of got these yellowing, this chlorosis on the leaves. But by 8 days, they were just green and fine and happy. And so this is kind of like what it looks like. We've got Linuron metribuzin here. This is like non-treated, and then these are at the later rates. You can see how much yellower it is. We're growing pretty good when they were bigger. This is 8 to 10 weeks. So this is some of the data that we developed. So this is crop injury here. So from 0 to 100%, 0 would be no injury, 100% would be plant being completely crispy brown and dead. And then the darker bar is 2 weeks. This is just visual rating. We estimate how much injury happens. So this would be 2 weeks after the treatment, and then the lighter green would be 4 weeks after the treatment. And got all our treatments here. So our non-treated, our pre-emergence, even our emergence treatments by 2 and 4 weeks, they had no injury. But what was interesting, when we did about those 4-inch tall plants, at 2 weeks there was significant injury. We did put a rimsulfuron, that's Prism here. We did put it with Linuron here just to see as well. And then our late post also caused quite a bit of injury, and the injury continued even 4 weeks after we applied the product. So that's kind of what we expected. We expected to see pretty good injury, right, from the taller plants when we sprayed them. And again, it's not something you would do, but we just kind of wanted to understand what the limitations are, what would happen. But what's interesting here, these ones right at emergence, we didn't see any injury. We only saw it. We weren't planning on doing any evaluations right after, 3 or 4 days after, but I was just out in the field walking and I noticed that, so I just took some pictures of one day. But as far as yield goes, so this is our non-treated. So you see, numerically there's a little bit of reduction. That's from the weed pressure, right? Because we didn't control any of the weeds there, because we didn't want to injure the plants. We probably should have hand weeded that just to see what the perfectly healthy plants would have done compared to the treatments, but this was a few years ago. These are your pre-emergent programs. It's just 2 rates of Linux. We had 12 ounces and doubled it in 24 ounces. This is where it gets interesting. So those emergent treatments we did, we saw some injury early, but they were rebounded really quickly. Statistically, no different than the emergence injury, and even the post ones, like the 4-inch tall plants, statistically similar, but you can see numerically they were a little bit lower maybe. But then the late post, of course, we saw pretty good yield loss as expected because we really burnt those up pretty good. But the point is here, this is a situation where, say, you weren't able to get your herbicide on right away, and really the target was this right here. What would happen if we put on the herbicide right at emergence? I'm not encouraging this by any means, but the point is there's some compounds that, you know, you might be a little better off if you had to spray it then, or right at cracking, you know. They may not cause as much injury as other products. So it's just something to think about. But again, it's not labeled for that, but again, we wanted to develop data because a lot of times in my job I get, I kind of get in between like the grower and then the chemical rep. You know, the grower applies a product, they have a bad experience in their field, something happens, they say, oh, it's definitely this product. The chemical rep comes out and says, no, that's not my product. And then I get in the middle and I'm trying to sort it out, figure out what really is going on here. And this is kind of one of those results of that, right? So somebody sprayed something maybe a little late, they don't really tell the truth, but does it or does it not really cause significant injury, you know? So it's kind of as a result of those kind of situations I get involved in a lot of times too, so yeah.
Andy, yesterday we had the question about what's the impact of varying degrees of weed populations or pressure and impact on yield. So again, the non-treated was non-treated.
Yeah,
This one?
the weed pressure was very low in this field.
Okay.
It was extremely low, yeah. And it was a fumigated field, and what's funny is some people say, well, I'm going to put a little higher rate of fumigant for weed control. I'm like, that's a really, really expensive herbicide, you know. The fumigation will help with some weed control is what I would say, and I think that in this case helped.
So I'm not sure, but that.
Yeah, I know, but I'm just saying, because I think that's why our weed pressure was lower, because they fumigated, and I think that helped reduce that weed.
That is the question that the
population.
grower will go through in their mind. Okay, so I missed that ideal pre-emerge window. Yes, I know I'm going to cause some, you know, crop injury, early foliage damage. And then you talked earlier, it's a great way to say it, is our job is to help them with risk mitigation.
Yep.
The crossover line, where is it? I don't know on PI, how many fields you would say we have low weed pressure? Probably 0. Okay.
Yeah.
So the crossover line can happen pretty quickly if not controlled in weeds. So looking at your yield depression, it's probably a pretty small price to pay still for getting
Right.
good weed.
Well, I had that other data where my non-treated yield would be like in here,
Yes.
you know, and I've got data on, it just depends on, you know.
So go through that again and the stages there of,
Yeah.
so you had
These
brown
are
crab.
pre,
and
this
then
is
you did-
2 rates of, this is metribuzin hold the same, when your is doubled from the first to the second.
Yeah,
Those are pre, those are your typical pre, where the sprouts are probably 2, 3, 4 inches underground.
okay,
This is right at emergence. I think 1 year we were about 50% emergence, the other year is about 60% emergence when we did it.
okay,
And this is mid-post, which I would call about 4-inch tall plants, about like that. And then the late post had been like 8 to 12-inch tall plants, somewhere in that range. They're pretty tall when we sprayed them.
so to say a 2 to 4 inch field where you have significant weed pressure, or the recommendation would be go ahead and spray.
I wouldn't recommend it because it's not on the label.
Oh, sorry, that's reality, geez, there's a.
No,
sorry.
but
Sorry.
the point of this project, like I said, was mostly for what happens if they're just starting to crack, what happens if they're just starting to come out of the ground. We want to get an idea of that. Originally, we were just going to do one of these. I think I did this over 3 years, this project, because I think every year we got 3 of the 4 timings in, just because when you get thunderstorms, I can't go out there with the metal boom in my hand while there's thunder and lightning blasting through it for 2 or 3 days, right? So sometimes you just can't hit those timings. So this was over 3 years. I got every one twice, every one of these timings at least twice, some of them 3 times, but yeah, it was.
Yeah,
it's a
sorry,
tricky
you're right about
experiment to
the
do
label.
when it's 2 hours away from you and you're trying to get the timings right and you're dealing with weather. So.
Yeah, yours is being recorded, I apologize, but we tend to, I really, I'm from away, I moved here, and I really love the word ground crack, because we have the same thing with soybeans.
Yeah.
And it just seems when we reach ground crack, there's this whole massive panic thing that sets in. And what you're saying still is just try to stay the course for a few more days.
It just depends on the compound too, right? Like I wouldn't do, like say reflex,
Like
I would
reflex,
not do that if they're
that's-
cracking. You're gonna get a lot of burn, right? I wouldn't put glyphosate on if they're
Right.
cracking, that's gonna be problematic. I wouldn't, you know, I mean, you gotta be careful, you gotta think about what the herbicides are, even dual's gonna cause some injury,
But
you know?
in this case, this one,
Yeah, in this study, and the other thing you gotta remember too, here I didn't tell you, but we have really good favorable weather conditions, right? So the plants were actively growing and able to metabolize and work through everything. This is Russet Burbanks, grown in Perham, Minnesota, and also I think we did 1 year in North Dakota. But we had good growing conditions too. But yeah, I mean, you gotta look at all the factors, right? I get called into the random one-offs where it is a train wreck and all the stars align and you know, the worst case scenario, I mean, they're very rare, but they do happen sometimes, right? Where the grower did everything they were supposed to do. They put the product on the right timing, everything went the way it was supposed to, but for whatever reason, between the timing of the crop and the environment and everything happening just right, you get a big injury. And you've been in the industry long enough, you've probably seen that happen somewhere or somehow. And it's just, again, those things happen, they're very rare, but they do happen, right? So.
we had this last year with exceptionally warm soil, just mass, crop just accelerating through in 14 days versus 3 to 4 weeks.
Yep.
And many growers were caught off guard going, whoa, wait a minute, I haven't got my pre-emergent waste. So it can happen again, but that was the one that
Yeah.
came up a lot.
Well, exactly, I mean, you're right, and that's the thing, if you're not coming back and re-hilling, you plant when you hill that planting, and if you're 3 to 4 weeks before they emerge, you really don't want to put your herbicide on right after planting, because you're gonna lose it by the time they just barely pop out of the ground. So you're gonna hold that off as long as you can, right? So it's again, it's tricky, right? And I got more of a agronomy physiology slide that shows actually that rate of sprout growth. So between 50 and 70, 75 degrees, that rate of sprout growth is pretty linear. So the warmer you get, the faster it grows, and it kind of plateaus around 75-ish, 23, Celsius. But yeah, if those soil temperatures are warmer, that seed piece is going to grow a lot faster. Also, if it's physiologically aged and primed to grow, of course, it's going to move quicker too. But yeah, soil temperature is huge, but also your weeds are going to grow a lot faster too when it's warm. It's going to increase the growing degree, and it's for them. They're going to want to pop out of the ground quicker, especially if you've got rain and moisture to help them along. So yeah, I mean, it's every year is different. Farming is not like a factory. We can't just put something in and get something out at the end of the day every year. So.
Do we want to take a brief little break and just to get a water or coffee, wash or whatever, and then once we're back, we can get rolling on a couple other little topics that I asked Andy to do.
Orientation is over. We're back.
Yeah.
And any other questions on herbicides, I guess, before we jump into some other topics?
Yeah, you should be done.
Maybe we'll be talking about the glyphosate.
Yeah, we're getting into that, yeah. Okay. Well, you'd be happy to know this is a Cavendish grower in North Dakota's field right here. I took a picture of this. Dan Ray Farms. So.
Oh, really?
Yeah, this is off Dan Ray too. So, okay. So glyphosate. So when I started my position in 2012, okay, I kind of got into all of this stuff. I went behind the ears straight out of grad school, didn't know anything. And I had these growers calling me saying they have all these problems with their emergence of their potatoes. And I had to go out and figure out what was going on. And I was like, okay. So I spent a lot of time on a few different potato farms that year, seed farms. And ultimately what it ended up being, we ended up determining that there was glyphosate in the seed that was planted. So the year previously, in 2011, they were exposed to glyphosate in some way or form. And that seed had residues in it of glyphosate, and it caused all these problems of emergence. And from that, we started to do some research and a lot of extension education, and I've talked about this glyphosate thing all over the world way too many times, and don't even want to talk about it anymore. I've talked about it so much. But it's an interesting thing that happens because potatoes are kind of like the canary in the gold mine when it comes to glyphosate. They're extremely sensitive to it, especially a seed crop is extremely sensitive to it because it puts it in the tubers. The tubers are a storage organ. It holds on to it, and then the next year when you go to plant those potatoes back, you have problems. So here's a case study from a few years ago. I got called out to a potato seed. This is a potato farm, 40 acres of seed. And the grower called me and said, hey, I think I might have some herbicide injury. So I said, okay, I'll come out and meet you there at the field. I go out there, and the day I show up, there's a sprayer spraying the soybean field right next to it with the wind blowing into the seed potato field. And these potatoes are already damaged. This is their second round of glyphosate, okay? And so we walked the field, we looked at it, and I'm like, yep, symptoms, they sure look like glyphosate. This is that field the sprayer was spraying here from a different angle. You can see the yellowing. And this field, these plants, they lit up this bright neon green. I don't usually see it quite this bright. This is an extreme example, but you can see here we've got plants right along the edge, clearly affected by the herbicide. Here's another angle. You can see it's very obvious here for the first 10 feet or so, but I could go 200 feet up the field and still see symptoms of the injury. Very slight, but I've seen enough of this that, you know, I know what I'm looking for. Probably most people wouldn't recognize it 200 feet in. But yeah, you can see the plants are stunted here and they're small. They look pretty normal throughout here. But there is glyphosate. And you know, there are other things that can cause yellowing of the upper leaves, like an iron deficiency, or you know, water stress can do that, right? Things like that maybe. But anyways, the seed inspectors, they said, well, this couldn't be glyphosate because look at all the weeds here. They're growing just normally and fine. I pointed out some of the leaves here, the weeds here. You got your pig weeds or lattice quarters. They're like, it couldn't be glyphosate. They're growing just fine. But again, potatoes, they're kind of like the canary in the gold mine. Takes a tiny bit of glyphosate, boom. They're having problems, they're showing injury, right? And we even dug some up. You can see this cracking that they were having as a result of the herbicide injury. This would be more normal. You see just a little bit of yellow here on the leaflets, on the margins of the leaflets. That's more normal. What we see with glyphosate, they don't usually like have that neon green color. But anyways, what happened in this situation is we had 40 acres of potatoes. Two of the sides, I think, would have been the west and the south had soybeans, and on the east had sugar beets. And all three fields seemed to have drifted into that seed field. And in North Dakota, our rules for seed certification basically say that if you have herbicide injury in the field, the whole entire field becomes disqualified from becoming seed. So long story short is two growers and insurance companies ended up buying a lot of potatoes that year that they weren't intending to buy at the beginning of the year. So not a good situation. I think they were able to still salvage some of the crop, you know, for just a fresh pack out. But even with, you know, you can't, I mean, these aren't going to be sold. They're not good for anything. And the other problem is, even if glyphosate comes into a commercial field, I think our limitation in the U.S. right now is 20 parts per billion. You can have up to 20 parts per billion of glyphosate, but if it's over that, you can't sell it for food or feed. So these aren't fun situations. Nobody wins, right? But at the end of the day, you know, it's not the seed grower's fault. Then, you know, you got to figure out how to deal with that and how to manage it, right? So my job as an extension educator, I'd like to say extension educates, and our state, or you say province here, regulates, right? So I come in, I help figure out what the problem is, I try to gather data and information and educate the grower and the other parties involved with what's going on. But then after that, I leave it in the hands of people who have the authority to regulate and deal with, you know, how they're going to handle that, right? So that's kind of an example of what we often deal with. And when I first started my position, I think I counted about 12 different fields that had glyphosate in the seed and caused problems with the plants. I'll show you a little bit more what that looks like in a bit. But the good thing is, as a result of doing this, we steadily decreased the amount of cases, and I think our growers are very well educated now, and you can't prevent it 100%. I still seem to get a call every year or two in our area where we do have an issue, either the seed or somebody's crop gets drifted on or whatever. But I do get calls from all around the world. That happens everywhere. And unfortunately, I mean, it's not like a situation you want to have, but when a grower's in this situation, it's a big deal to them, right? Because their livelihood is there on the line. So one of the big reasons I think we have problems with it is because we do grow a lot of GM crops. We grow corn, soybeans, sugar beets that they spray glyphosate on, and a lot of people love to use glyphosate on the wheat at the end of the year because there's a label to control some of those late weeds, right? But the reality is they're probably more trying to even out the wheat so they can harvest it, right? Not have green spots, right? So anyways, so that kind of, you know, after working on this and looking into it, trying to figure some of these things out, like how did the potatoes get exposed to something like a glyphosate or another chemical, right, that shouldn't be there? And there's a lot of ways that this can happen. And so I've got some fun pictures to document some of these situations and cases. And it's not always drift. You know, drift is the easy go-to. You know, people might say, oh, it's drift. But sometimes there's other things like, I see a lot of drift, but I also see a lot of tank contamination when people don't clean out their tanks properly. And I also see a lot of inversions. Inversions are a little bit more difficult to determine, but I'll show you some of these things. So here's an example. Our railroad spraying, you can just see how much fog coming out from here, right? And when you're spraying a right-of-way or a railroad, they often have chemicals that last much longer than you'd use in crop production. They can use much higher rates, maybe 4x the rate we would be able to use in a crop production. So they're spraying extremely high rates of products that can last extremely long time. So, and yeah, I was driving through a little town one day in North Dakota and I saw this. I'm like, oh, I gotta get a picture of this. This is fantastic. So, but this is a situation happened here. This is in Minnesota. There was actually potatoes on the other half of this field, but they already desiccated them, so I couldn't get a good picture. But these are soybeans. And they spray the rail line. One of the compounds they put was dicamba. So it's sprayed on the ground. You get kind of warm temperatures in the 80s, high humidity. It'll actually volatilize. So it picked up off the ground, volatilized, jumped the fence, and then boom, spread out through the field. And this was over several miles that this happened. Soybeans are the canary in the gold mine for dicamba. You stick a jug of dicamba next to a bean plant, not even open it, it's going to curl up probably. So, you know, it's that bad, right? So. But volatilization can happen. There are certain chemistries that tend to be more likely to volatilize. It's your aromatic carbon type products. So that's why I like dicamba. It first came out, Banville, it was had super volatility, right? And then it goes to clarity, which isn't so bad, but it still can volatilize. And then they have these newer ones they use for the soybeans, but they still can volatilize, it's just a lower amount. So. Airplanes can be a problem. We had a situation here where a hose broke flying over seed potato fields, so they got to buy seed potatoes that year. Yet not a good situation. Actually, that plane was actually, I think, going to spray a wheat field in the fall. So, but it made for some good pictures. But high rate here, but what was interesting here along the margins, I was able to get some good pictures and samples and stuff, which has been good for educational purposes. So it's nice of the grower to call me and let me know that this happened. And anyways, got to see it. Of course, drift, like I said, can happen when the wind blows. With drift, when we're trying to figure out what happens when there's a herbicide case, patterns make a lot of good information for you when you're trying to discover what happened. And with drift, it's always going to be some kind of pattern along the field edge, depending on the direction of the wind. As you get gusts, it's going to ebb and flow usually, but you're going to see kind of a titration from really affected plants to less and less affected the further you get out. So that's pretty common for drift. If it's a tank contaminant, it's going to be, you know, wherever that sprayer sprayed in the block. So this is drift here. There's a cornfield here, drifted to the soybean. Anyways, can't see here. Here's when they don't clean out the boom. What happens, right? I drive around a lot. In my area, having covered 2 states in the U.S., it's not uncommon for me to drive 4 to 6 hours a day in the summer just to hit a few fields or research sites. So you get to see a lot of things like this. So I always have my camera ready to go. So there's one where they didn't clean out the booms clearly. Here's another one where the booms weren't cleaned out. So, you know, they might clean the tank out, but they forget to clean the boom out, right? That could be a problem. And just think if this was a seed potato field, and somebody doesn't pay attention to that, and they harvest that, and that gets mixed in the bin, you know, I mean, it's not a lot of sacks, but it's going to cause a lot of consternation for whoever gets that seed, right? They're going to be called the seed grower, like, what's wrong with this seed? Here's a situation where you have a misapplication. So there's 2 spray planes go on this day. One was going to a russet field. This is the red field. The loads got mixed, and so this is actually phosphoric acid burn here on red Norlands. But that was supposed to go to the russet field. And what was interesting in this situation, the plane actually missed this small area here, so we had a good reference check. So to their detriment, right, they didn't do a good job spraying, and it was a really clear way to figure out what would, and there was some yield loss, and so they were able to compare the two, which was nice. They actually had didn't have to guess in this situation. But again, you can put the wrong product on the wrong field and cause problems. Here's another version of that. Somebody rang a field of soybeans with the wrong product. So it was actually pretty close to my house. And then you have soil carryover, right? Like I talked about earlier, when you're renting land, and you probably don't have as much issue here, just understanding your guys' rotations and what you grow here. But there are, soil carryover issues with a lot of compounds out there in the world. And for us in the U.S., most all of our labels will say like how long that crop rotation restriction should be. And so we have our weed guide in North Dakota. You can find it online if you just look up NDSU weed guide. But this is just a little snippet. We have 2 pages of this, but we'll have all the products here. We have the crops up here, and then we indicate how long. So this is my quick reference that I go to when growers call me if I don't know a herbicide very well, because since I don't work in the corn world or the soybean world or anything like that, I'm not as familiar with those compounds. So this is a place I go to get out their information quickly. But basically, you can look at a product. I circle potato because I usually highlight that column for myself, so because that's the only important one. So in my world. But anyway, but you can look on this. They'll say like how long do you have to wait? 10 months, 9 months, 0. The NCS is like next cropping season or 2 cropping seasons. So it just gives you an idea of what that rotation should look like. And so it's just a tool that I use to help our growers out when I get phone calls, right? On, I got this piece of land, but they put atrazine on it last year. Do you think I can grow potatoes in it and whatnot? So it helps you answer those questions. So that's the thing. If you're looking at land and you're looking at potentially growing potatoes and they've got a herbicide, look at the rotation restriction. I encourage growers usually to get at least 2 years worth of herbicide information, because some products can carry over for at least 2 years. If you get Pursue, it's 26 month, so it's in this product, I think. So there's some that go, but if you're 3 years out, if you're in the 3rd year, then you're usually gonna be pretty safe. But anyways, but yeah, soil carryover can cause issues with emerging potatoes like this. This is that up here, or what? It was one of the Indians, I'm trying to remember. Yeah, but anyways, this is what happened to the seed piece. It started sucking in some of the product. You get these short, stubby, bottle brushed roots. Leaves are tight, oat shape. Here's another view of it. So sometimes people ask, okay, what's the difference between a seed issue and a soil carryover issue? And how do you know the difference, right? And so field patterns is actually really important. If it's a seed-borne issue, when you look out in the field, it's going to be randomly scattered throughout the whole field, like from that seed lot, right? Not every plant is usually going to show a symptom, and you're going to have variability. You're going to have some that have a higher rate, maybe some that have a medium, some that have a lower rate of the herbicide. So you'll see kind of this variability through the field. If it's a soil carryover, it's going to be a lot more consistent through the field, or maybe where that sprayer sprayed in that field and it wasn't cleaned out the previous year, or whatever. Or if you had overlap, you might see a little strip, you know, through a field where there's overlap, or at the ends like we talked about. Maybe if they were spraying the headlands and, you know, had some overlap, you might see it there. So patterns will really help a lot. But in this case, so this is a seed piece from the previous one where you get these bottle brush roots. This is a glyphosate affected seed that was planted back. So you can't always tell by just looking at them. That's why you have to use the other factors, the other information you can gather in these situations. And then we get inversions. So this is in North Dakota, and they were spraying, I think it was yellow toad flax. So some of these weeds that are very difficult to control, they can put on some pretty heavy compounds that last a long time and can be really hurtful to potatoes. But anyways, you see some patches here they're trying to control. But yeah, I think we have an inversion in this case where, so an inversion, a good way to explain an inversion is, you know, when you're driving down the road, a gravel road, and the dust is flying and it just kind of all settles out really flat and smooth, maybe 10 or 20 feet above where you're driving, or the same with smoke, right? Someone's burning a fire, the fire comes up, the smoke, and then it just kind of levels off. That's a good indication that there's an inversion going on. And so an inversion is really defined simply as when the air temperature at 10 meters versus like 1 or 2 meters is more than 3, we say 3 degrees Fahrenheit difference, but maybe it's a Celsius, 1 to 2 degrees Celsius difference, right? When you get that difference, all of a sudden you get that layer of air that just stays stable in that area. So if you're out there spraying and you have very fine particles in your spray, it can get caught in that inversion layer, and then just like smoke or dust, it will slowly move away and then eventually drop somewhere else, right? And so an inversion could go 1 or 2 miles potentially. And that does happen. Our state climatologists in North Dakota, we have a huge weather station network, and they've been putting up these temperature sensors, you know, 10 meters and down below, I think it's 9 or something like that. 10, or not 9, 10 and like 1 or 2 meters or something like that, but to get that difference. And with his data, he's shown actually that we have a lot of inversions in the afternoons and in the evenings. And so what we've learned is it's actually better to spray in the mornings to avoid inversions, which was really interesting. Now here's a case of inversion. You see here we've got kind of some potatoes here that are highly affected, but then not here close and not there. It's just an example of how the herbicide picked up, kind of moved a little bit and dropped down. I've got another picture here. Doesn't show it maybe as well, but there's a cornfield way over here, and it was interesting. There's some spots where you can see the inversion cloud kind of went over there, and just the corn stopped it and just boom, just dropped right there in front of the corn. Just these little patches like that. So it was kind of a, you know, from a weed science perspective, kind of interesting to see and see how it did that. But anyways, we do see this happen. I think we have it happen more often than we realize, because it's really, really hard to prove an inversion happens. It's very difficult. Because sometimes I get called into fields, and like say we get called into a field like this, we test the tissue, we find out it's whatever compound. You talk to all the neighbors, nobody sprayed that compound in any neighboring fields. And so then it's like, well, where did it come from, right? And oftentimes you probably think it's probably an inversion from somewhere further away, and it's just, you know, you start increasing that radius, it becomes very difficult to track it down sometimes. And these are difficult situations from the grower. If you don't know where it came from, then the grower's got to deal with it, right? And then what do you do, right? So it's not good. So other ways herbicides can come in contact with potatoes. I've dealt with a couple cases with contaminated water that had glyphosate in the water. Reusing jugs. This is why you don't go spray your Roundup and dump it in a different jug that says Echo or something on it, right? And you think somebody else is going out to the shed to grab the product and they put the wrong product in the tank, right? That's happened. Even I've had a situation where we had product that had a specific label on it, but there's a little bit of contaminant in it. We tested it and found it. So there's so many ways that this can happen. I'm never surprised anymore when some weird situation happens, right? and you get a herbicide. I get called out on all these herbicide injury cases, or get phone calls or emails or text messages from people from who knows where. Anyways, but like I said, not fun situations, nobody wins, but you got to figure out what's going on so people can understand what the problem is, and can they sell the potatoes, or what do they do about it. If it's seed, it's a lot more problematic because some of these things can go in the seed. So, any questions on how herbicides move, how herbicides might affect the potato plant? Probably scared you all now to death, right? Nobody wants to spray anymore. Okay, so that just kind of helps set the stage for okay, this next part. So when you do have an injury situation, how do you figure out what it is? What do you do about it, right? So there's different symptoms that happen from different herbicides. That's why we talk about modes of action, how they work, what systems they affect. It can help, again, narrow down what it is we're looking for and maybe what to test for. And so you have things like, this is actually metribuzin. There's where you can see the venochlorosis. It's the only compound, I know that causes that. And eventually, over time, what it does, if it kills a plant, you get the chlorosis now and then in between the veins once it continues to go. This is Ignite that we sprayed over as a contact herbicide. It's just going to burn what it touches, and that's just the upper leaves. This is, I don't remember, this might be glyphosate or an ALS inhibitor. So they kind of affect plants differently, the compounds, and that helps. They leave signs behind, when they do their damage. So if you want to play potato CSI, you got to look for these signs and figure out what's going on so you can determine the cause. When you have translocating herbicides, they're going to move through the plant, right? They're going to go, like I talked about this earlier, they're going to go to the younger leaves, the roots and tubers. They're going to move. They're not going to affect the older leaves. Contact herbicides, they're just going to injure what they touch. So again, your regulum, when you spray, you're trying to get good coverage. You're trying to cover every leaf so that you can get them to die, right? So this is a really simple way to just kind of break down how herbicides work, right? They can either kill what they touch, or they can move through the plant, okay? So ones that move through the plant, the ones that get me, kind of keep me up and working on things that, for growers, or these groups. Groups 2 is 4 and 9. 9 is your glyphosate, 4 is your growth regulators and your ALS inhibitors. So this is just a little schematic, show you kind of the idea. So what happens, say there's a herbicide that contacts the plant, it's going to move up to the young growth, and it's going to move down to the tubers and roots. You're not going to find injury in the middle of the plant with it. It's just not where it goes. It goes to the growing points, okay? So when we have injury, like here, this is from that field I showed earlier, you can see how those younger leaves, they're showing the injury. The older leaves, they look fine and normal, okay? Growth regulators, group 4s, they tend to be fairly quick to show symptoms. You're probably looking at less than a week. You're going to see that cupping, curling, epinasty symptoms. I'll show you those in a minute. Glyphosate and ALS inhibitors tend to be a little bit slower. They might be between 1 to 3 weeks, just depending on the rate and the plant development and whatnot. So this is a growth regulator here, group 4. You can see here the new growth. You got the bubbling here of the leaves. You've got kind of this, sometimes get elongated, they'll say parallel venation, kind of this elongated skinny leaf. The limbs tend to go maybe more parallel than perpendicular. You get these leaves that kind of curl up and twist up. Sometimes we call this an alligator head just for fun because it kind of looks like that. But we gotta have fun sometimes and come up with our own terminology, right? So, but anyways, this is kind of symptomology you get from a growth regulator. Okay. This would be more like, say, a glyphosate or an ALS inhibitor is going to cause this kind of yellowing in your young leaves and leaflets. And then this would be, again, your desiccant or contact type herbicide. So it seems like when I look, so we do sometimes, we'll spray a bunch of different compounds out for a field day, just to do some training on modes of action and what happens. So we'll show the leaves and then also dig tubers up. Pretty much any herbicide that stresses out a plant is going to cause tuber cracking. So when you think about herbicide injury, it's really a physiological disorder, right? You guys have heard physiological disorders. We have lots of things like hollow heart and jelly ends and all these other things, right? That are physiological disorders. Herbicides would really kind of fall into that category because a physiological disorder, one of the definitions is it doesn't spread to plants nearby, right? It's not spreading. So herbicide injury is really located in that plant that got affected, and then the environmental conditions and the herbicide kind of amplify that, right? And so when a potato plant gets affected by a herbicide, it's going to disrupt its growth, it's going to cause it stress, which often results in tuber cracking or distortions of the tuber. So here's just some pictures. This is some glyphosate. I think that was glyphosate too. Dicamba also does similar things. This is a Mazamox carried over in the soil. It caused the folding there. I can't remember which compound that was sprayed. Sometimes too, this was from a seed field a few years ago. There's some drift into it, and we were digging samples, and we'd actually noticed with the plants on the edge, nearby where the drift was, we actually increased the amount of scab, because again, I think the plants were stressed, and so increased the amount of common scab that happened on these tubers as a result of the herbicide injury. But what's interesting here too, from a physiology perspective, you can see the root hairs here. So if you're trying to put calcium on, that's the timing you want to do it. So, and then sometimes you have herbicide injury and you don't get any symptoms. It might happen late in the season and they look perfectly fine and normal and nobody ever knows. And those are kind of the harder situations, like say someone's desiccating a crop next to your potato crop and you're maybe a week away from desiccating your potato vines. You never see any injury in the foliage because at that point in time the tuber is just pulling everything out of the plant. So you see no damage in the foliage, no damage in the tubers. Those tubers get planted back the next year, and the seed grower's getting all these phone calls, what's wrong with my potato seed? And then I get a phone call to come out and look at it. And you look at the seed and it looks perfectly fine, but it's just a fact of it happens so late in the season that tuber was pretty much done growing, and you don't get the result of any kind of symptomology. And those big cracks and things like this you see, these often happen, I would say early on, probably early to mid tuber bulking, because as that tuber develops, those cracking will also develop. So anyways, there's a lot of things that cause growth cracks in potatoes, okay? It's not just herbicides, so if you see growth cracks, don't call me and say, I for sure have a herbicide injury situation. So that happens. That's the problem. I give this herbicide talk, and then everything is a herbicide problem, right? So growth cracks are caused by a lot of things, right? Especially in dryland, you guys know, you get a lot of water stress, especially some varieties, some genetics are just very likely to have cracking, right? It's just a normal, common thing that happens. Even viruses have been shown to cause cracking, and different diseases can cause cracking. So there's a lot of things that can cause cracking. So I got this seed lot one year. This is two seed lots. Grower contacted me, said, oh, I got a seed lot, it looks really bad. I think I probably have herbicide. So we took this, we tested it, actually found no herbicides in it. No, glyphosate was the one we were worried about, but didn't find any. They planted it, grew just fine. I mean, it looks ugly, but it was a dry growing year, I think, the year before, so it was probably just the fact this is seed grown in dryland. So, and the russets in dryland, especially Burbanks, or these might have been Rangers, I don't know, but sometimes it doesn't play nice. This one, these reds on the other hand, did have glyphosate in them, and they did have the cracking. So, again, it's a sign that you might have to help you out. So, talked about this. A lot of things can cause cracking, not just herbicides. So keep that in mind. When you are looking at seed, though, like I said, it can be a tool to help you, the cracking or maybe growth, but this is from heat stress, that's from herbicide. So is it a herbicide, is it not? It's hard to say, you need to look at that and see. So with dicamba, these are some of the things we often see when the mother plant's affected. Some of the growth regulators cause deep rise, you get these malformations in the tubers, etc. When you plant it back, sometimes it can have slower emergence, sometimes it doesn't. One of the things we notice too with the growth regulators, which is interesting when we plant them back, oftentimes those first leaves will look normal and fine. I grew some in the greenhouse this year. They were fine for the first 8 or 10 leaves, looked perfectly fine, and then they started showing symptoms. And so the symptoms are going to look just like if you had a drift situation or a tank contamination situation. It's going to be the exact same thing, the twisting and folding of leaves. It's going to be the exact same thing from the seed that's planted back. But the difference is just you see some plant, this is my research plot, but see this plant looks normal up here. These look pretty bad, and look at this picture here. These look really bad, and then these look pretty good, except this one's starting to have some injury come up and this leaves. But so you get varying levels of injury in the seed when it's a seed-borne issue, because I think what happens is those tubers, they're all sinks, they're all pulling, photosynthates, and they're all pulling energy. And when you get a herbicide coming to the plant, every tuber is going to pull a different amount in, maybe depending on the tuber size, and that's why you get this variability in your seed and the herbicides happen. So glyphosate is going to be kind of similar. Like I said, you have a lot of cracking. These are pretty extreme examples. These are from plots that we intentionally sprayed and we did this as research, but this is I think this is Ivory Crisp we did early on, but you can get cracking like that too, maybe a little more likely. This is pretty unlikely. But what you see from glyphosate, two big things I look for. One is this kind of slow erratic emergence pattern that looks like this. So you'll get some plants that look pretty normal and fine. They probably don't have any glyphosate in them. You get some that are slower like these over here that probably have some glyphosate in them. And then you have some like right here that look like skips that have probably a high concentration of glyphosate in them and they don't grow, or they're super slow to grow. So that's probably one of the first indications I look for. The second one is I look for this multiple stem. So they tend to not have a dominant stem. They're like a bunch of little minions with no leader. You know, they're all trying to go up to the surface and they can't quite get there. You know, this is a really extreme case here. You get multiple stems coming out of an eye, and then sometimes we see kind of some weird leaf malformations from glyphosate. It disrupts the way the plant grows, and the way glyphosate works is so you know, we all have amino acids. There's essential amino acids, right, that we all need to grow, and plants do too. It actually stops the production of the aromatic amino acids, so you're basically taking out 3 different amino acids out of that plant, and so that disrupts the way it grows and develops. And so anyway, so this is a field. This is just some early research we did, just comparing plants side by side, just to see what would happen. And so, I mean, we did see a reduction in the total weight of the hill, we just compared a bunch of plants, one that was severely slowed down in growth and one that seemed to be growing normally. And so anyway, basically the weight went down, the number went down of tubers, and the mean tuber weight also reduced. But what we've learned, and this is really early on, but what we've learned, this is just kind of a comparison of plants side by side, but when this situation happens in a commercial field, I usually get a call about 5 or 6 weeks after planting, you know, depending on how fast they emerge. And usually the situation is it looks really bad, people are freaking out, oh no, I'm going to lose half of my crop. But what I've seen in most of these situations, it's usually maybe a 10 to 20% yield loss depending on the severity. It's not as bad as it seems. But what does happen is the big plants like this or this that have some space next to them, they tend to have larger size tubers. The small ones tend to have smaller tubers, so your size profile gets pretty wide, pretty crazy. So your quality goes down a bit. Okay, so we did other work because they introduced the dicamba resistant soybeans. What's it been? 6, 7 years ago, 5, 6, 7 years ago in the US? And that was all because of glyphosate resistant weeds. They were trying to find another way to control the weeds, right? So, well, let's just run the herbicide on them. So, anyway, so what we did, we looked at this, different rates of glyphosate. All right, so this is, we broke it up into 2 environments because we did this in 4 locations. We did it in 2 locations over 2 years, so we had four runs of this experiment. And so some of the environments was weird. 1 year on one location we had a lot of injury, the other site we didn't have any injury, and then like the next year it flipped and it was opposite. So we just combined the environments. This is what made sense with those statistics. But this is your non-treated, and as the rate went up, as you can see, this is the crop that was sprayed the previous year, and then we planted it back. So markedly, it'll definitely decrease as our rate went up. This is dicamba alone. Similar situation where we had a little bit more injury. The lower rate of dicamba caused more injury loss. And then we combined the 2 because that's the idea behind what growers were going to do is spray a lot of glyphosate and dicamba. We wanted to understand what would happen to seed potatoes. And even these kind of medium low rates that we used, we did see a significant reduction in marketable yield in our research trials. And so that was kind of the point of it. You know, dicamba can be just as bad as glyphosate in seed potatoes. That's why we did this work. Fortunately, we don't see as much dicamba problems. I see it a bit just as a very light injury that causes a little bit of injury on the leaves, but from a seed perspective, we've seen very little of this, which is good. We see a lot of glyphosate, and that might just be the fact that we spray so much glyphosate late in the season for burn down, and it's just such a common herbicide everybody uses for all kinds of things. We still see a lot of glyphosate. I see probably more clopyralid as far as carryover in seed than dicamba. So it's just a little bit stronger compound. So anyways, that's kind of on herbicide entry symptoms. Is there questions on this?
So if you find you have an injured plant from a herbicide injury, is there anything a grower can do other than just let it grow out, depending on the injury?
That's a good question, yeah. So what do you do? Not a lot that can be done realistically, as far as there's no magic, there's no silver bullet, no magic spray. You know, we've tested some compounds that claim to help plants recover. But even just looking at some of the research that's been done in other crops and other situations, and with what I've done, the best thing you really can do is you want to give that plant everything it needs to be happy. So fertigation or fertilizer, water, you know, keeping the diseases off, right? Anything you can do to keep it happy, right? It's as healthy as that plant can be, is as best it can help overcome that herbicide injury, right? So it's kind of like you and me as humans. If we get sick, we pick up a cold. If we're just so busy working, we don't sleep, we don't eat well, it's going to stick with us a lot longer, right? But if we get good sleep, we get good nutrition, we take care of ourselves, we're going to get over that virus or that cold quicker. It's kind of like, that's kind of how I equate a plant to herbicide injury, right? The plant's happy and healthy, it's going to be able to overcome it. But if the rate's too high, it just won't. But at a very low rate, it can potentially. So,
Thank you.
yeah, unfortunately, I mean, we've tested stuff. I wish there was something we could do to reverse these, but it's hard. So, because I mean, these compounds are they're made to stick around in that plant for a long time. You know, 2,4-D was the first herbicide developed. It was developed during World War II in both England and the US. There's different groups working on it. And for plant growth regulator for hormones like indole acetic acid is a naturally occurring one. They were trying to use that as a herbicide, but the plant was able to break it down so fast it just didn't provide good weed control. And that's why 2,4-D was developed, because it just persists a lot longer. And that's why. So, but what do you do though? Like, yeah, what else can you do? So this is kind of, I'm just going to scoot through these slides pretty quick, but I do get questions often. What do you do if you have a herbicide injury situation? How do you handle that right? So there's different things you can do, right? So you can visually look at it, you can have an expert come out at it, you know, and say, okay, this looks like that, or this looks like this, right? And you're making an educated decision based on that. You can do a laboratory analysis, and that's what we do typically if it's a big case, a big issue, right? Because I mean, a circle, like for us, a circle of potatoes is 120, 130 acres. That's $750,000 right there, right? So it's a lot of money, right? So if it's a bad issue, we're definitely going to do laboratory analysis. If it's seed, you know, that you're questioning, you could send in for a lab analysis, or we do sometimes. We do grow it in the greenhouse for growers. We'll grow the seed out and test it. So this is just a quick, again, back to symptoms. If you want to download this, I got a quick link here. You can see it. It's z.umn.edu/herbicide. You can download that. I can send some posters to Ryan if you want some. We made this a few years ago. But what's interesting, you can see like those tubers, they're going to show cracking, like I said. Leaf symptomology will vary. So I kind of grouped the modes of action together, put 2 and 9 together because they're pretty similar. It's the glyphosate with all the ALSs, and then your group 4s. And then some of the other ones down here are just showing pictures of what the leaf injury looks like. So potato growers like posters, so we made a poster. So, right, everyone likes one in their shed, right? So, anyways, but you can score the injury. Doesn't work great because the symptoms vary so much. So we've tried to actually, we'll do a laboratory analysis. We'll get all these numbers back. We try to correlate that with the amount of injury and the amount of yield loss. It just doesn't work. You just get too much variability in environments and how the plants respond and how they regrow. It's really not good. So we use lab analysis really as a, it's yes or no. Either it's there or it's not there. That's kind of the way I use them. Either the compound's present or not. I got a pretty good feeling on glyphosate with some varieties. We've seen enough of it. I get a number back at its seed that's being grown. I have a pretty good idea of what it's going to do just based on my own experience, but yeah, it just doesn't correlate. That's what everyone wants to know, right? Oh, I got this injury, what's it gonna do to yield? Well, it's hard to say, right? So we talk about that.
And did you, when you sent to the lab, so there's no limit, kind of minimum that,
There is,
constant?
I'll show you here. So this is like a lab analysis I get back. Limit of detection is important. Is that what you're getting at? Yeah. Limit of detection is really important. So if you're looking for glyphosate, and this is what I've learned, there's a lot of labs that will only go down to 0.05 parts per million. And a lot of our glyphosate ends up in this 0.02, 0.03 range. And so if that lab only goes down to 0.05, we might miss it. So it's important to find a lab that has a lower limit of detection. So this here, we screened, we had some potatoes, we screened them for both what was called a plant growth regulator analysis. So they do 5 compounds, T4D, clopyrrolate, dicamba, MCPA, and picloram. And then we also screened them for glyphosate. What came back was dicamba was positive at 0.01 parts per million, and glyphosate was positive at 0.017 parts per million. So basically we knew we had dicamba and we had glyphosate in these tubers. You know, and with the growth regulators, the group 4s, the symptomology is all the same. So it's hard to know what compound it is. This is the only way to really figure out the compound that it is through a lab analysis. But yeah, you gotta look at your limits of detection, limits of quantification, they call it here, but LOQ. But some compounds, they have much lower limits. Other compounds are a little higher. It depends on the lab, depends on the methodologies they're using, depends on how comfortable they are, right, at going down to these lower levels. With glyphosate, I find once you're below 0.01, it doesn't really do much. Like if you're at 0.007, like I found that before, it's pretty minimal, the effect. So 0.01 is a good threshold for glyphosate. I've had it all the way up to 0.1 or 0.2 in really bad situations. But yeah, you're usually in that 0.01 to 1.1 is typically the range where we see all the glyphosate problems. And the majority of them are between 0.01 and 0.05. The majority of them in that small area. It's not very much, but anyways, this is where we see them. So, like, what would you do if you want to sample? This is a document on this, because when I get so many calls of people asking me, well, how do I sample? That means I need to provide some information for them, right, on how to do it. So it helps them and it helps me too, right? So simply, this is just a really simple version. You can download this here at this link here, z.uma.edu/injury. But the simple version of this is if you have injury, you want to make sure you document it right away, because sometimes after 2 or 3 weeks it will disappear. You might get new leaf growth over it, you might forget about it, and then all of a sudden you don't worry about it until harvest, and then all of a sudden you see a bunch of ugly tubers and you're like, what happened here? So document it, take pictures, fly a drone, whatever, you know. Take a sample. So if it's a translocating herbicide, sample the tissue that's injured. Don't sample the old days, you're not going to find it there. Your whole objective is to validate or verify that what's there, it's there, right? So you're going to sample the leaf tissue that looks injured, you're going to sample the tubers. Most labs usually want about a pound worth of material, 450 grams, right? It's typical. You can do a chain of custody if you're worried about it, you know, being a big issue. Sometimes we do that if, you know, there's a lot of money on the line. We clean the sample up, just wash the dirt off, and then we just ship it to a lab overnight, basically is what we do. So it's a little more detailed here, but that's the quick version of it. So that's how you'd sample it if you need it, get it done. Like I said, sometimes we grow things out in the greenhouse as well. If a grower just wants to look at seed, we won't. Because the thing is, if we're doing a sample like this, and we're sending tubers in, we might only send like a dozen tubers in. But if you want to look at a seed lot, sometimes we might look at 400 tubers here in the greenhouse just to give us a better view and we can visually see. And so typically our winter grow out for recertification is a 400 tuber sample. In the greenhouse, like I said, we might do 200 or 400, depending on what the grower wants. And this is from this year. We grew some seed out. You can see here. These are the ones I was talking about. These are, I think this is called pyrrolate, I believe. I think is what it was. We knew it was there. We just weren't sure how much of it was in the seed. And as you can see, a lot of these plants grew fine and normal for quite a while. Then they start showing symptoms. See that little bit of cupping on the leaflets? There's another one there. Here's got quite a few. These leaflets are getting cut up. So there's a lot. We put like 50 seed pieces in these trays because it's how we can efficiently use our greenhouse space. So there's a lot of plants in here, but you can see the injury. So that's what we were doing. We were trying to quantify how many plants would have injury. So it's just another way of looking at this. Some people might call it a bioassay sometimes too. You know, you could well, bioassay is more for soil, but if you're worried about soil carrier, sometimes you put soil in a tray like this, plant some susceptible seeds like cucumber or lentils or something like that that tends to be really sensitive to herbicides. You can look for that herbicide injury in a bioassay. So, and then like I said, we winter test for our seed certification. Sometimes we see this in our winter test. So that's herbicide injury. So, and then there's always the question: is winter test a good metric, right? Because sometimes you have a drift situation and only the edge of the field is affected, right? What if you took your sample from the rest of the field? You know, did that get picked up? Or in situations where a grower has an issue with herbicide injury, say this end of the field was harvested first, only that end of the bin had the herbicide injury and the rest of it didn't. You're comparing your seed lot with your neighbor's seed lots, and they say, well, we don't have any problems, it must be your issue, but sometimes it's just went into the bin because maybe a boom wasn't doing a very good job on the field right next to it here. So, anyways, another thing that could happen, sometimes this is glyphosate here and here, sometimes it's so bad that you don't get emergence from the seed. And oftentimes on the winter tests that they do in the US, you guys do everything in the lab here for your seed test?
Yeah.
Okay, but if it doesn't emerge, are they digging it up? That's the question I have. You know, if they don't see emergence, do they just consider a rotted seed piece, or are they actually digging it up and looking at it? And so sometimes you might miss them if they're like this, if they don't dig them up. So, anyways, it just talks about, yeah, what do you do if you have it, right? So let's skip that. So, any questions on sampling for herbicide injury? Pretty clear? Good. And then the other thing we do in our area, I got this out of the UK, this idea, but we put these signs up in the field just to let neighbors know to be careful spraying herbicides near our fields. This is specifically for seeds because seed is much of a greater issue, right? If you get herbicides in the seed. So some of the things we teach our growers too. One of the big things we did early on when we started doing this, I think a lot of our problems were self-inflicted through tank contamination because a lot of our growers do spray glyphosate on their other crops like their soybeans and their corn. So one really inexpensive insurance method is have a dedicated sprayer, right? So a lot of our, and I've heard that here too, a lot of growers have their own sprayer for the potatoes. And it's a really good insurance policy because you screw up a few fields of potatoes, you can probably buy yourself a few sprayers pretty quick, right? So, again, cleaning out your tank, talking to your neighbors is important. We have a public map called Drift Watch, so people can put sensitive crops on it, people can check it before spraying to see if they're downwind. The signage like I showed you. And the other important thing too is just to scout your fields regularly, so if you see injury symptoms, you want to document it as soon as you can. So. Here's just an interesting scenario here. This is just to help seed growers to think about, okay, if I have a herbicide injury problem, what happens if I sell the seed, right? So just say theoretically you have 100 acres, it's worth $7,500 an acre, that's $750,000. If you plant that out, even if it's, I probably did my math wrong here, it should have been 1,000 acres here, 10x. At 5,000 acres, that's 5 million. So you take a $750,000 problem and turn it into a $5 million problem, right, pretty quickly if you don't catch it and deal with it. So this is my called cowboy math that I do. I'm not an economist, but I just do it. So, anyways, and that leads to the question: what do you do, right? If you're a seed grower and you know you have a problem, do you destroy your seed? Do you regrow it? Do you sell it for feed, food? Can you, if it's a very light amount, can you sell a full disclosure to your grower? Just let them know, you know, we have a very small amount of this, and what other options are out there, right? So, again, this is risk management decisions and how do you deal with this and how do you handle it. Can you regrow it on your farm? So something like glyphosate, we found the daughter tubers of the mother plant tend to show injury, but the granddaughter tubers, we don't usually see any problems if you can grow it another year. Because either it self-eliminates, it doesn't grow, or the ones that do grow tend to overcome the herbicide by metabolizing it. So depends on the product, what it does. So, okay, last part, volunteers. So volunteers are not something I deal with a lot because we're extremely cold, which is nice. But a good way to think of volunteers is they're soil pathogens hitman, right? They're gonna store your lake blight, your black dot, your nematodes, and, they're gonna repopulate all these fun things for you, right? With zero control on them. So some research, I believe this is out of Washington State. The picture clearly is from North Dakota. Could be the beautiful NDSU flag there. But where did they find, the leftover potatoes that didn't get picked up? 25% of them were on the surface, 45% of them were in the top 10 centimeters, and 20% were deeper than 10 centimeters, right? You could go do this on your own to figure out what it looks like on your farm if you want, but it's just, I like this because it gives us a good idea, what that distribution of the tubers are through the soil. Because why this is important, I'll show you in a minute, but because it depends on how deep your frost layer goes, okay? So, further, this research showed that, basically every size of tuber is probably going to grow. The smaller ones a little bit less, but still you're at higher than 85% for all of them, what they showed, Washington of emergence. So that's a pretty high percentage to having emerged in the next year, right? So this is Australia. This is volunteer, they call them self-sown. So you can see they have a problem here. It looks like it's planted, right? So what do, right? Different options. There's environment conditions, which we use a lot in North Dakota, Minnesota. You got some chemistries, herbicides potentially. Maybe you can use tillage or competitive crops, or maybe there's animals, right? So there's some different things to think about in controlling your volunteer potatoes, right? So here's information from Pacific Northwest. What they've shown in their research is that if you have 28 Fahrenheit or -2 Celsius, so we can go both ways here, at 8-inch depth or 20 centimeters, for 50 hours, you can freeze the tubers and kill them. You can cut that time in half if your temperature goes down to -10 Celsius, right, at 8 inches. So you think about it, it's a tuber. It takes some time to freeze all the way through, and that's what this is showing, right? If you want to freeze that tuber all the way through, it's going to take some time. So there's this critical level, right? Temperature, -2. You need to be below that for, a certain period of time, right? If you're going to get good kill. So for us in North Dakota, we have, again, this weather station network we have also deep soil temperature probes, which are really nice. We've gathered a lot of great data. So just take two scenarios here. We got Adams and we got Fargo. So Adams here, we're below that -2 or 28 degrees at 30 centimeters here. So all you got to do is maintain that, for 4 or 5 days and you'll get killed, right? Whereas in this scenario, you're at Fargo, you're only below that threshold at 5 centimeters, right? So if I had tubers down here and we never got colder, they would probably survive. So having soil temperature monitoring can help you understand this, right? Hard problem is when you get snow, right? You get that early snow and it insulates the ground. That's usually when we see volunteers. We don't see them very often. I probably see maybe 1 in 5 or 6 years I see some volunteers, but it's pretty minimal in our area. But snow, of course, insulates the ground, and therefore you don't get cold, and then your cold temperatures don't really work. This is fumigation, but we do crazy stuff. Here's another scenario where there's a grower, they actually plant some corn rows for some reason between their potatoes, and it acts as a natural snow fence, and so sometimes we see carryover from that because you get more snow there. So my predecessor, Dwayne Preston, was really big on also training growers when you're getting rid of potatoes, to not pile them up, not bury them, right? To leave them on the surface, let them freeze or run over them with a tractor or something, right? Squish them to make sure you get rid of them. So so those are things you can do. As far as chemistries go, everybody wants to know, can I spray them right? Can I kill them off? Sure you can. Again, you can use your rotation crops to do this potentially. I've got a list here I'll show you, but a lot of things may not be labeled in Canada. But again, we go back to glyphosate. So this is interesting. So we just talked about glyphosate, a very low rate of glyphosate causing problems in seed. But then sometimes it can be very difficult to kill a volunteer plant with glyphosate. It's like a little tiny bit really affects it, but it really takes a whole lot to kill it, probably more than the label may sometimes. So they like to grow back, right? So the kind of glyphosate's an interesting one. So if you can get ones that translocate through the plant, that's going to help, right? Because if you just burn them, just like a frost, it's going to regrow usually, right? Most of those tubers are going to regrow. the NFT system that was set up, they wanted NFTs that were, I think, at least 16 or 17 millimeters because they could regrow if they got killed, right? If they're smaller than they didn't have enough energy. But most of our volunteers are much larger than 17 millimeters, so they probably have the option to regrow 2 or 3 times, I would think. They probably have plenty of energy. But anyway, that's why translocating herbicide helps. It can boost to the plant. If you just apply like a burner, it'll kill the tops like a frost, but it will probably regrow. So some of the products that have been tested in the US that have been shown to help with volunteer control, here's just a quick list. Again, I don't know what all you guys have here, but these have been tested in the US. And typically, it's not just one application, but you got to do some maybe 2 applications or 3 to really get good control. But they can definitely reduce that one application, definitely reduce your volunteers and really try to hold them and set them back. Okay. This is like I think this is like a one shot because the multiple shot was these ones. These are your multiple shot. These are your burners. So talking about putting those on multiple times, you just burn them back, you regrow, you burn them back, you regrow. So this is a list of the contact type herbicides. So this is interesting. So this is shoot removal. This would be just like putting these burners on, but instead of just cutting the shoots off, it would be the same idea as just burning them, right? But this is from Pam Hutchinson in Idaho. But basically, she shows this is the number of tubers per square meter. If you don't do anything on a volunteer, you can have maybe over 120 tubers. If you burn it, take the shoots off once, well, then you reduce it down to maybe 90. You do it twice, maybe you're reducing it down to 70. But 3 times, then all of a sudden, magic, right? So, but it takes 3 different times to do that, right? You just got to keep hitting it back, hitting it, right? So that's one way to go about it, potentially. So the other thing is tillage. If you're plowing, you're going to bury them deeper, right? Remember I showed you the distribution and the different soil levels. If you're plowing, you're probably going to put them a lot deeper and they're going to have a higher chance of survival, right? Because it's probably not going to get as cold as deep, right? So, but keeping them near the surface, could be best. So, another thing to think about, maybe you could do spring tillage. There's been some work that shows you do some spring tillage and then maybe you spray them, 10 days after you do your tillage once they pop up and start growing. Here's some options here: fluoxivir, oxyfulfuric, glyphosate. Right? That's been shown. That's been worked on in the U.S. So, other things, competitive crops. Maybe you're putting a competitive crop out in the field that can really help reduce its growth and development. Some of these crops could potentially use tillage or herbicides that maybe they're not used to. So the one thing is slow growing crops, probably not a good idea. So, or that have a more open canopy. So more volunteers. And then there's animal control. Brian mentioned that, in the UK, that, people use hogs, send them out to the field to eat the tubers. So you probably don't want them eating the leaves, but if they can go out there and root around and fry the tubers, it would help. So, so maybe that's an option, right? So different things you can think about potentially using. There's no silver bullet again here. If it would be easy, everyone would do it, right? So we got some challenges in our lives. And then this is Australia, I think, but their system is they sometimes just grow a potato crop or 2 and then put it into pasture, right? And that helps too. So the big reason we don't want volunteers, of course, is late blight. So, like I said, my predecessor said, don't do this, don't pile in piles, they just insulate, not a good idea. Skip that one. Here's from, this is a potato field right next to some of our research plots on a research farm, and they bury their seed potatoes with dirt thinking that would stop them. Not a good idea, okay? Just to point that out. See all these potatoes popping out of here? You got a field right here and you got all these untreated potatoes. What if they pick up late blight or get it full of beetles or something, right? And you're just harboring them all for the field. So, anyways, but yeah, late blight's a big reason because we want to get rid of that inoculum. No inoculum means no problems, right? And I think you guys are like us. We get creative and get the snowblower out, right? Chop them up. That's a good option too, right? So, anyways. So, so information on late blight, we got an article on that too if you're so inclined to want to read about that. But yeah, I mean, that's the big reason, right? We worry about volunteers, at least for us, is for late blight because we're in protected plants, right? So that's why I throw the late blight stuff in at the end. And with that, I think I am done. We've spent our, what, 2.5 hours now? And you all are still awake, that's amazing. Who has questions?
Any other questions, folks?
Andy, other than those wheat, barley, canola, that you recommend as competitive crops to avoid volunteers, in terms of to control weeds, in your one of your first slides of your presentation, you mentioned crop rotation. Which kind of crops growers in North Dakota or Minnesota are using, other than this ones that on non-potato years?
Yeah, so we wrote, depending on the area you're in, sugar beets often follow potatoes because they're good scavengers of the soil for picking up all that fertility we left behind. So people like to follow sugar beets, corn, soybeans, dry beans. Those are probably all the big ones, wheat, barley, yeah. North Dakota's interesting because you go to Idaho, it's just potatoes and wheat or barley, potatoes, wheat, barley, right? But we grow a lot of other crops in rotation, and some of the legume crops are nice too because they can fix nitrogen and leave some nitrogen credit behind, which is nice too. So, corn's kind of a pain to plant potatoes behind because of all the trash it leaves. I don't, especially for research, I hate it. So it's a pain, but sometimes you have to, right? So, but yeah, it's a varied mixture, and the nice thing, like you get corn in the rotation, there's a ton of herbicides labeled in corn, because like I said earlier, most herbicides are developed for corn or soybeans because they're over 100 million acres between North Dakota, or between U.S. and Canada. U.S. has got like 80 or 90 million acres of those, and yeah, Canada, I mean, that's the market, right, for the big ag chem companies, right? So they got this huge portfolio of products. I mean, they do heavily rely still on glyphosate, they can, but there's a lot of other products. So if you're the grower, you're controlling that ground, yeah, you can plant corn and then you can put in some other compounds in there. They may even have a long residual, you know, like a couple year residual for potatoes, but that's okay if you've got 3 years, you know, and then you can focus on either weed control or volunteer control or anything like that. So, and that's the other thing, sometimes when we have volunteers, it's really nice to have a corn crop in there because you can, a lot of those compounds I showed you are labeled for corn, so you can really hammer them with that, so. Yeah.
And if you have a market for it, specifically maybe cover crop market for it.
Yeah.
Cereal rye is really good for weed suppression as well, right?
I'd say most of your cover crops in general are probably good competitive crops, right? Because you can plant them at even a higher density if you need to. But I think most of your cover crops would be a really good high density crop, right, Brian?
Yep. And cereal rye in particular is allelopathic and can directly inhibit weed growth. So it has some, we've seen also buckwheat and a few other crops can help keep weed densities down a little bit.
So you got to think about, I guess, yeah, what works for you and your system, and you know, what makes the most sense on your farm.
Any other questions? If not, thank you, Andy. I just had 5 minutes of your time here. So I just wanted to share with you a couple of tools. A couple I've known about for a while, a couple I sort of just rediscovered in the last, or discovered in the last little bit. So we've talked a lot about weeds today. If you, I'm sure I have this on. Okay. There we go. Who's got a weed app on their phone? Couple? Okay, it's a good, like, there's a couple of decent free weed apps out there if you're looking for something and you want to identify it's something you haven't seen before, where you're just trying to target, especially early season, when stuff's only at, like, you know, just coming out of the ground, you're trying to figure it out. So there's PlantNet is what this one is. It's one I use. I find it's reasonably good. There's also Picture This. There's a couple other ones out there. Most of them are free, so give them a try, depending on, I know this one works on both iPhone and Android. So they're just a good tool, especially if you got like newer people working with you, like crop scouting, like say students, that sort of thing. It's a good option to have. We talked about chemistries, and we talked about, you know, herbicides and stuff like that. If you're looking for a good resource on where to find what's available, and also quick access to labels and all that sort of stuff, OMAFRA, the Ontario Ministry of Agriculture, has a really good site they call the Crop Protection Hub. And so, and it's just Google Crop Protection Hub and OMAFRA, or potatoes and OMAFRA, and you'll likely find it. But I'm going to send the links out in one of my upcoming potato or agronomy updates. But like for example, if I put potato in here, all right, I don't have the internet on this at the moment. It's going to be harder to show you. But if you use this tool, you can search by crop, and it'll come up with, like, this one is specifically for weeds. It'll show you all the herbicides that are available, whether they're pre, post, like different timings, and then you can click onto them. It'll have a note on efficacy on what types of weeds, and then it'll also have like all your return intervals and all that sort of stuff. And you can click through to the labels. So it's a good central location to get labels. So that's a good thing for it. They also have the broader crop protection hub. So if you click on vegetables here, vegetable crop production, then that gets you a list of all the other, like, so all your fungicides and insecticides and all that stuff is all in here as well. So if you're, for example, you're trying to find something that works for early blight and brown spot, you can put both of those in there and click them, and it'll tell you all the products that are listed for both, and then they'll tell you the ones that are maybe listed for only one of them. And it'll also give you efficacies of them, right? So this is a good tool if you're trying to broaden your search. Now, you know, the one thing I'll note, if you're growing for Cavendish, you're growing for somebody else, and they have an MRL list, you'll have to layer that on top of this, right? So you'll have to make sure that whatever you find that's registered in Canada has an MRL that you can use for production. But yeah, it's a good tool. And then, you know, if you're updating your spray records, or you're, you know, just updating your list of what you have for Canada Gap, this is a good tool for finding all those labels. So, and then lastly, this is an IPM. This is the Ontario IPM. So who's got the Ontario Field Guide? A hard copy of the Ontario Field Guide? A couple. So I got a couple of them. I guard them with my life because I don't make them anymore. So, and then, like, even asked about reprinting them, and they don't reprint them. But they've taken everything that was in that guide and put them on this website. And they've also made it searchable. So let's say you're in the field and you took a picture of plant symptoms on a leaf and you're not 100% sure what it is. You can go in here and you can say, just put in leaf. And it'll show you all the pictures of stuff with leaf diseases or leaf damage. And then you can kind of go through them and sort of see, well, this maybe matches me or doesn't match me. You can narrow it or broaden it depending on what you're looking at. So if you don't have that guide, or you're looking for like a good scouting guide, this is a site that you can do. I clicked through it a little bit more, but I didn't have an internet connectivity here at the moment. So but I'm going to send out these links in my next agronomy update, so you'll have those as well. So I just wanted to pass along a couple of those little tools. OMAFRA is usually really good about putting those types of tools together, so make sure that everybody knows about them.